Welcome back to day 2 of our 2022 ACEP, the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference virtual workshop, Going with the Flow, Ocean and River Energy in Alaska, sponsored by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I'm Jeremy Kasper, the Deputy Director of Research here at ACEP at UAF, and thanks for joining us. So I'll start off with an overview and review of what we talked about yesterday. As we shared yesterday, this is a series of 4 virtual workshops, and there's 2 remaining workshops after this one: hydrogen in the high north, April 5th and 6th, and then on May 3rd and 4th, electrify everything, leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is supposed to happen in person May 24th through the 26th at the Denina Center in Anchorage. First virtual workshop on nuclear energy was held in February, and following the hydrogen in the high north, and then electrify everything again will follow after this one. So if you get a chance, please visit the website. It's alaskasustainableenergy.com to register. Today we feature a lineup of really great panelists and presentations. So panel 3 will cover marine energy, cross-cutting issues, environmental regulatory, grid integration, and community. And then panel 4 will talk about wave energy technology and deployments. First, we'll start with a few housekeeping items, then we'll give a brief recap of what we heard about yesterday, and we'll feature some videos during that time. This will be followed by a quick interactive poll, and then at 8:45 Alaska time, our first panel will start. That will be followed by a 15-minute break at 10 o'clock, and then at 10:15 we'll go into our final panel, which will be followed, and both the panels will be followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A. I think there might be a little bit more time in the last panel for Q&A. And then we'll wrap up with we'll bring back the moderators who can be here for that final half-an-hour discussion at the very end. And it'll be an open forum. We'll have the moderators summarize what they heard during their panels, and then we'll do one last Q&A session. And we'll wrap up right at noon. Again, we start with a few housekeeping items. Please introduce yourself in the chat. If you can put your name in there and the organization and where you're logging in from, we'll capture that with the meeting. And so the presenters have really engaging presentations, and there's polls. There will be at least one poll. I think it's only one. We'll see. So please respond to those. I think the first one, if I'm remembering correctly, is a little bit of a trick question, but I'll give credit due where people get one of 2 right answers there, I think. If you're having trouble with audio or video, please chat to event support for assistance. During the workshops, all attendees will be muted, and you can submit your questions using the chat feature. We'll also try and monitor the Q&A, but definitely try and get them in the chat. The moderators will basically be harvesting those questions and then fielding them at the end of the panel. And if you put them in the chat, we'll try and capture them, and if there's any that remain unanswered, we'll try and get back to you with an answer. The recording of the workshop will be available at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website after the fact, alaskasustainableenergy.com and /virtual workshop. So please continue to check back at that website after we're wrapped up here. So before we dive into today's panel, I'll kind of briefly recap what we heard about yesterday. Levi Kilcher with the National Renewable Energy Lab kicked off the first panel of the day, looking at all the energy in Cook Inlet. That's kind of the big elephant in the room in terms of hydrokinetic energy in Alaska. And then we followed that with a look at some of the work that's being done at UAF here at ACEP on kind of new-ish technology for capturing river energy, and then an analysis of site suitability for the Kuskokwim River. And that one was a nice takeaway. The takeaway there on the site suitability was kind of a simple method, or a simpler method, for figuring out where hydrokinetic energy might work. In the second session, we saw kind of the most recent, the latest and greatest from the developers including Orbital Marine, ORPC, and Verdant. And we heard from those three companies, and there's a few others around, have been working in this sphere for a pretty long time now. So we got a sense of how long it's taken to get where they are. And, looking forward, they're really poised to take advantage of some of these big resources. We also heard a bit about how financing of these projects has changed over the years. And it looks like we're really getting to the point where, especially in Europe, on the Scottish side of things, the financing models are much more mature than they used to be. So they're talking about bonding and getting away from crowdsourced and venture capital type investments to really government-backed. And we've got some positive developments in the state that might drive us along that pathway here as well, including the RPS standards that have been proposed, and then the proposed Green Bank as well. So some positive developments there. Another theme that we heard come up several times was beneficial electrification. So basically, if you got all this energy, what do you do with it? And start talking about converting non-electric loads to electric, heating being the big one for Alaska. Beneficial electrification only makes sense when electricity is cheap and clean, but it may be a way to help push the overall project cost down for technology like marine energy, which is still new and, as you saw, still fairly expensive. So BE might be a good way to make those economics make sense. And then we also heard a little bit about grid services. So what does marine energy provide that renewables that are a little bit more intermittent, like wind and solar, may not be able to provide? And the main one there for marine energy is stability. Finally, we heard a little bit about hydrogen as well. And so there was a little bit of discussion there about hydrogen as potential for seasonal storage of these renewables. In case of river energy, you guys all know that we have to deal with the frozen river for a long period of time. So if we can produce a lot of energy in the summer, then hydrogen might be one way to store that energy. But also, if we start talking about resources like Cook Inlet or some of the resources in the Aleutians, there's a tremendous amount of energy there beyond what we have the capacity to use in the state. So hydrogen for export might be another way to use some of that energy and then make the economics of the projects even better. So great chance for me to plug those two upcoming workshops, the one on beneficial electrification, and then also the hydrogen workshop, and then finally the sustainable energy workshop that's in May. So we'll hear more about those topics during this series for sure. So before we get started with the next panel session, I'll share a few videos recapping a few of the things that were covered yesterday, and then the videos will be followed up immediately by a poll at 8:45 a.m. Actually, sorry, the poll will be right before 8:45. The panel will be at 8:45. And the first panel, again, is on cross-cutting issues common to wave and current energy converters. So here we are jumping into the first video. The first video features Levi Kilcher from the National Renewable Energy Lab talking about work in Cook Inlet. Levi is originally from Homer and was our first panelist of the day yesterday.
My name is Levi Kilcher. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Lab. I'm a marine energy researcher leading the resource characterization portfolio for water power. We're looking at wave and tidal energy today, and we're getting ready to make some tidal energy resource measurements in Cook Inlet, Alaska. Cook Inlet is an extremely energetic tidal energy site, and that's why we're working here to make these measurements. But it also comes with huge challenges. Just a couple miles up the inlet from the site where we'll be making measurements, in the past we've measured 20-foot sand waves underwater. So these are sand waves that are undulations in the seafloor made of sand and silt that are 20 feet tall from top to bottom. So that's pretty remarkable, and I think it shows the amount of sediment that's moving through here, and also just the dynamic and energetic environment that you're dealing with. But that also means there's risk of our equipment being buried in these types of sand and so on. And so that's why we've designed these systems to float in the middle of the water column. Other systems that we have on the seafloor have bladders that we will be inflating to sort of lift them up out of the sand. And we're going to be deploying this buoy here along with two other mooring systems in that channel right off of the East Foreland near Nikiski, Alaska. Alaska, and those are going to be in the water for 2 months, and we'll come back and get them. Behind me is our stable moor buoy. This system is going to fly in the middle of the water column. It's got a 5,000-pound anchor on the bottom, and it has upward and downward looking acoustic instruments that measure the water velocity throughout the water column. We developed this system in collaboration with the University of Washington, actually, the Applied Physics Lab. Really grateful for the support of that team. The other system that we'll be deploying is a bottom-mounted system. So it's a bottom lander that will set down on the seafloor. And the big challenge there, or risk there, is sand or sediment kind of covering it up. So we've designed that system with inflatable air bladders that'll inflate and make the system buoyant. And so it can actually rise to the surface just on these air bladders alone. And so that's, I think, a really innovative thing that TerraSonde actually came up with, and I think it's promising. I'm excited about it.
On the A-frame.
HEA is interested in NREL's resource because characterizing the tidal resource in the Cook Inlet is the first step to developing tidal energy here. And we're really hopeful that the information gathered from this study will be of great value to a potential tidal developer in putting a project together here in the Cook Inlet. Alaskans have always had a special relationship with the sea. Some people make their living from the sea, many of us recreate on the sea and even supplement our dinner table with the bounty of the sea. And we think it would be great if this research could lead to a way in which we could actually harvest some of our energy from the sea.
Alaska had oil and gas resources here in the ground for millions of years before they were discovered just 60 years ago. And during those last 60 years, oil and gas has actually done a lot for the Alaskan economy, but oil and gas is waning, where our resources are dwindling, the pipeline flow is going down, prices are higher, and worries of climate change are making people think twice about burning oil and gas. But we have a tidal energy resource that could last us in perpetuity. So commercializing tidal power will really have a huge impact for the state of Alaska. We're very excited that NREL is in Alaska characterizing our resource. We believe it has a huge potential to be part of Alaska's future.
The ocean is constantly in motion, and ocean tides in particular are amazing natural energetic displays. NREL's research at Cook Inlet will be instrumental for technology developers to design and build more efficient, economical, and effective tidal energy devices that can survive high-energy marine environments. Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories are collaborators on this project. We need all hands on deck to discover opportunities for water power.
This work's supported by the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office, the Water Power Technologies Office within EERE. And this work is really critical because the marine energy industry is not yet at a size where it can support making these kinds of site assessment measurements themselves. And so it's funded by the public to help get the marine energy industry started. The work we're doing in Cook Inlet today is for tidal energy technologies, but I think a lot of the technology of tidal energy is similar to river current energy. There's a project in Egeluk, Alaska that NREL has been partnering with ORPC in deploying a RivGen device there. That's a really exciting project. Tidal energy, river energy, wave energy, these are all marine energy technologies, and I think they add to our mix of renewable resource options that we have available to us. And the Department of Energy has been investing in marine energy technologies for about 10 years now, and I'm really excited to be a part of the work. I think marine energy has a lot to offer our nation in terms of diversifying our energy portfolio.
So we got a nice view of some of the other technologies we talked about there at the end as well, the ORPC RivGen project, which we'll be hearing about again in a few minutes on the first panel, and then also had a quick snapshot there of the Verdant, the tri-frame that was going in the water there in their Roosevelt Island Tidal Energy Project, the Wright project that's in New York. The next video we'll queue up features Ben Lefler from the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and it's a quick overview of some of our work on new technologies that may eventually be able to provide power to homes along rivers. The water horse technology was developed by Renergy, and UAF is interested in the technology because of its low cost, its relative simplicity, and the potential to make a river energy system that's more tolerant of debris. So we'll queue up that next video now.
The water horse gets its name from its use of the Egeluk phenomenon in fluid dynamics. It's a unique approach to hydrokinetic energy and quite different from conventional turbines. In July of 2020, ACEP researchers tested a water horse prototype at the Tanana River test site. The prototype is based on an approach developed by Renergy Incorporated. The prototype field testing is intended to prove the concept at scale and to learn initial design and operations lessons. Using data collected and lessons learned from this 2020 prototype, ACEP will develop a second prototype for testing in 2021. ACEP designed and built this prototype with funding from the Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office. You can learn more about our hydrokinetic energy research at the ACEP website.
So we're hearing from Ben Lefler here at ACEP. He was a speaker in the first panel yesterday. So the final video is a nice lead in to our third panel and features work being done by our colleague Andy Seitz at the UAF College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. Andy's been working on quantifying potential impacts to fisheries on these types of devices for a number of years. So after the third and final video, we'll follow up with our final engagement poll, and then we'll immediately go into the first panel of the day.
So hydrokinetic energy is using moving water from either a river or tides to spin a turbine without damming or impounding water. And so one of the big questions to regulators and to resource managers is fish interactions with the turbine. So you have this turbine that's approximately 50 feet wide and takes up about 11 feet of the river water column, and the fish have to swim downstream as youngsters and then upstream as adult fish. And so the question is, how are the fish going to interact with that turbine as they swim to and from the ocean? Fish hydrokinetic energy research is really in its infancy. There's been several various research efforts around the world. Most of it's aimed at tidal energy research, and some of that's taken place in Scotland. Some of that's taken place in Bay of Fundy in both Nova Scotia and the US side in Maine. There has been some limited research in rivers, and that's all been done by AHRC. We've done research in both the Yukon and Tanana rivers, and then now we're starting up here in the Kwijak River. The AHRC researchers are also affiliated with PMEC, which is the Pacific Marine Energy Center. AHRC and PMEC are leaders in the field of fish research with hydrokinetic devices, and so as the industry develops, fish research will be a critical aspect of that. If we can develop the hydrokinetic energy industry, which is a clean, renewable energy, and have it not affect fish, I think that's the best of both worlds. Fish have really well-developed sensory systems. Early indications are that they avoid these hydrokinetic devices. As the device spins, it puts out several different pressure and turbulence and velocity fields and noise fields. The fish sense these fields and actively avoid the device both at the young stage and the adult stage. But most of the findings are highly species specific and site specific, and so we're going to continue that research here in the Kwijak River and see how the sockeye salmon respond to the turbine.
With that, we'll kick off today's event with a engagement poll. So there's a link on the screen there, and if you can go participate. And the question is, where is the first commercial scale in-stream tidal generation project over 1 megawatt? As I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a trick question, but we'll see what folks come up with. So we're getting a lot of good answers in the chat there. I've seen Maygen project a couple times in Scotland, Pentland Firth, there's definitely some projects in the Tanana River. Unfortunately, those have been smaller, so more on the order of 5 to 10 kilowatts in Nenana. None in Alaska. That's correct. There haven't been any really big scale projects in Alaska. Scotland for sure. Egeluk, I see that answer coming up. Egeluk project, that one ranges from, I think it's about a 35 kilowatt or so installation there. So it's, again, it's a little bit smaller than I was thinking of for this one. New York, I see, is coming up. That's probably the Verdant project. Again, that one's a little bit small, but I'll go ahead and give my answer. I believe the first one that's an in-stream project was in the CGen project in Strandford Lock, and that one is actually now decommissioned. And so that was early pioneer. And part of the point for me for this question was just to illustrate that, you know, this has been going on for a long time, and there's actually been projects that have, you know, been in the water for 10 years and then taken out. So there is a lot of learning in this sphere for sure. And with that, we can head into the first panel. So I'm the moderator for this one, so I'm going to be trying to keep track of 50 different things. So apologies in advance, but I'll jump right in since it looks like we're running a little bit late. Our first speaker is Dr. Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Lab. She holds the position of Distinguished Faculty Fellow at the University of Washington as well, and her research focuses on environmental effects from the development of wave and tidal energy and offshore wind installations as well. After Dr. Andrea Copping, we have Ms. Alexandra Salmon, who's the president of the Egeluk Village Council, and then Mr. Baxter Bond, who's a research professional here at ACEP. With that, since we're running late, I will jump right in. Take it away, Andrea.
Thank you. Share sound. Thank you, Jeremy. Just getting my share up properly and do it so it'll work. Let's see. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen. So I want to say thank you very much for having me here today to talk about some of the environmental effects of ocean and river energy, particularly in terms of regulations and environmental risk. I am with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Seattle, Washington. I also represent a group called Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, which I'll talk about a little later, but it's a consortium of 16 countries around the world who are trying to look at environmental effects of marine and river energy in order to move it forward. So what I want to do is just say a little bit about regulatory processes. I'm a researcher, so while I deal with regulatory processes, I am far from the expert. But I just want to note a few sort of high level ideas around regulation, because there is a lot of it associated with this. In order to put a river or an ocean energy project in the water, there's a whole lot of federal, state, sometimes also local regulation. The typical ones deal with things like protecting animals, especially if they're populations that are already depleted or at risk. Things like the Endangered Species Act, I think everybody's heard of. We protect marine mammals in this country very strongly through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We have an international treaty on migratory birds, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And we also protect commercial species through the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation Management Act. A whole lot of acronyms, but those are all things that need to be navigated. We also protect habitats that protect animals and shorelines through things like coastal zone management and shoreline management acts. And these all stand at the federal level under an umbrella called NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. And there's also an Alaska Environmental Protection Act. We also protect cultural resources, other uses of the ocean or rivers, and usual and custom fishing grounds. So all that comes into play when we try to look at regulatory processes. But what I really want to focus on is how we determine how to meet these regulations. And generally, protection of species and habitats and so on is based on what the risk that's perceived to be from whatever development is being proposed, in this case, ocean energy. And so the research that's gone on this area, you probably know that marine, ocean energy, river energy is a pretty new industry and phenomenon on the world stage. So there's still a lot of early research, and most of that research from the environmental side is on this perceived risk idea. It's also important to note, sadly enough, that regulatory processes are not consistent from one region to another, nor are they well tested in this country or frankly around the world. So it means that there's still a lot of making it up as we go along. So that's where we really try to provide the science to support the decisions that the regulators need to make. It's also important to note that there's no clear timelines for getting the permits that allow you to put ocean or river energy in the water. It's not predictable, and this is a real ongoing problem for the industry. And to cut the agencies some slack, we're at a very tough time staffing-wise in government agencies, and there just aren't enough people with enough expertise to move this forward quickly. We hope that's going to change. But what I really want to get into, where I can talk a little more knowledgeably really, is around the science of it. And we think about how to address this risk to animals and habitats through a system we call stressors and receptors. Stressors are those parts of the devices, and I use MRE for marine renewable energy as sort of the blanket term for ocean, river energy, etc. We look at these devices and systems that might cause harm to animals or habitats as stressors, and the receptors are those marine animals, the habitats, and even the ecosystem processes. And after about 10 or 12 years of looking at this and working with colleagues around the world, we've come to these 7 sort of priority stressors that we need to really learn more about. And I want to spend some time going through each of these, and you'll see these little icons appear as I discuss these. But trying to understand how the system really works piece by piece is where we are. We aren't at the stage of looking at sort of the whole ecosystem yet. So collision risk. This is the big one that is really hindering tidal development and permitting around the world. We have this little dashboard, this little odometer over on the right-hand side, and you'll see this in slide after slide. I'm not sure if it's being obscured by the screen or not. It is on mine, but we try to give a sense of how high we think the risk is. And in this case, we have the dial up in the sort of the red to orange, because we consider this still quite a large risk. This is the risk that a turbine blade will cause injury or death to marine mammals, to fish, sea turtles, diving seabirds, etc. Now, what do we actually know? We know we've never observed a marine mammal or a seabird or a turtle colliding with a device. We've seen some fish come very close to and perhaps collide, but don't seem to show much in the way of harm, though it's hard to tell. The technologies we use to observe these collisions aren't well developed, and they're really difficult to operate. These are high energy environments. Often the water is turbid, and we don't have very good things fit for purpose. The other problem we have is if we see a collision, or we try to see a collision, we're looking at an individual animal. And what we really care about is the risk to the populations. If this animal were hurt, what would it do to the population? Now, this is just a little bit of an example of some of the data that have been collected. There were 4 cameras on this particular turbine. This is from Scotland, and it's typical. This is absolutely typical. One of them's not working. But what you see is 2 things here. One, the tidal turbine blades turn quite slowly, only as fast as the tide goes. And so they're very unlike conventional hydropower turbines or even ship propellers. So we don't have good analogs to figure this out. But you also see these small fish that are really not bothered. They're being tossed around probably a little bit by the turbine, but they're not being harmed. The kind of gear we use besides cameras are so-called acoustic cameras or multi-beam sonar. And what you're seeing here, and this is going to loop around, is imagine the turbine being down at the bottom here. It's not, it's a simulated turbine, but these are acoustic beams that are showing animals come into the vicinity. You see as it comes by, you see some, hang on, we'll wait till it comes around again. You see some fish coming in, not very close, but they're there, those little white things that swim by. Hang on. There's some fish coming in. And in this particular case, we caught a seal chasing them. And you see this seal kind of come in and out of view as it chases the fish. How do we know that's a seal? How do we know they're fish? We had a camera on here too. So this really illustrates the need to have multiple kinds of technologies to understand what's going on. And this is a pretty rare data set so far. So the next risk I want to point out to you is so-called entanglement with mooring lines. The concern here is if we have a whole lot of anchored systems, say in this case, it's a wave energy converter shown here in the drawing, there may be many mooring lines that go down to the bottom. And the concern is entanglement or entrapment of large animals like marine mammals or turtles. But really, we consider this not to be a substantial risk. The concern comes from stakeholders associated with death to marine mammals and others from lost fishing gear. There's a very fundamental difference here in that there is no loose end to these mooring lines or even the cables that are draped from one, say, wave converter to another. And there is not sufficient slack in order to create a loop. So the chance of entangling an animal like this is really, really small. So we consider on our little dial here, we consider this a very low risk. It is, however, a risk that is mentioned many times. And one of my postdocs and I, a couple of years ago, did this animated, it's almost a cartoon, but it's based on real data, of a humpback whale, mother and calf, swimming through a floating wind farm in this case, but it's no different than any marine energy device. And what we were really trying to point out, you can find the whole animation on that link on the bottom, we're really trying to point out how tiny the whale is in comparison to many of these other features and how capable those animals are of detecting things like the floats in the water column and moving through. So we don't consider this to be a real risk, but it is frequently brought up among stakeholders. Underwater noise. This is a risk we think is not as high as collision, but it is something that needs to be looked at. The reason we worry about noise is animals underwater use sound as we use light or sight on land. And so that adding additional noise can disrupt their ability to communicate, to navigate, and so on. High enough noises like pile driving can cause physical harm, but generally we think in these, the noise coming from the generators of a tidal device or a wave device as it creates mechanical to electrical energy is a continuous noise. And there are other sounds, of course, in the ocean. The really lucky thing here is we have an international specification, kind of like a standard for how to measure these noises because they're very high energy environment. And we also in the US have regulatory thresholds for what is acceptable for both marine mammals and fish. So this is really helpful. So far, the turbines and wave energy converters we have measured fall below those thresholds. And so we think that this is not going to be a major problem, at least with small numbers of devices. We also have lots of acoustic propagation models developed for the ocean. The US Navy is very big on these. They just don't work very well in these high energy environments we're in. So what I want to do is just play a little of this noise for you. I hope you can hear that. It's just a continuous hum. And this was actually from a device up at the European Marine Energy Centre in Scotland, Open Hydro. The company has since dissolved, but this is what it sounds like. And every once in a while you hear a slightly louder noise. It's not actually this device. It's actually a seal scarer from an aquaculture pen kilometers away. But the other thing I want to point out is that these devices put off noise, as you can see in the graph, across a whole range of frequencies. So somewhere in that frequency, there is a marine animal listening at every point. So we do need to pay attention to this. Similarly, we did noise measurements off a wave device. This is the Fred Olsen Lifesaver at the Wave Energy Test Site in Hawaii, and using both hydrophones, listeners on the bottom, and drifting. This was done by the University of Washington. And again, you can hear this one, sounds a little different. Oh boy, that one might be harder to hear. There is a rhythmic sound, And it was thought initially that these higher sounds, again shown in the graph with these sort of higher peaks at 50 to 700 hertz, was thought initially this might be a bad bearing on the device. So that's something to watch out for. But with further examination, it turned out to be the anchor chain clanking. So understanding what you're hearing and how you might mitigate that sound if necessary becomes very important. So we think we're getting a handle on the noise, underwater noise, but we're not completely done yet. Electromagnetic fields. We get electromagnetic fields put off from cables that are taking power from a device into shore. And the concern is that we may affect certain organisms. Now, there's only certain marine organisms that have the ability to detect this field. They tend to be some of the sharks, some of the rays and skates, and certain other fish, as well as crab and lobster. We've looked at this considerably. We know we can bury cables and separate the animals from the field. And most of the lab and field studies have shown that the amount of power carried by marine energy or river energy cables is not enough to disturb these animals. They may be aware of it, but it doesn't change anything vital to them. So we see this as a relatively low risk. We think we have a handle on it. Changes in habitat. We worry about changes both on the bottom habitat, the benthic habitat, and also up in the water column. You have the footprint of the device and anchors on the bottom, and then you have devices up on the surface of the water, subsurface, you have lines and cables, etc. But fortunately, this is not really any different than other offshore industries, and we can learn a great deal from oil and gas, from offshore wind, etc. So it really comes down to careful siting. If you have a whole lot of soft bottom habitat and one rocky reef, you don't put your device down on top of the rocky reef. So putting it down carefully, both the footprint of the device, the run of the cable, etc. We think this is really a quite low and very manageable risk. Changes in oceanographic systems. Here our concern is by putting these devices in the water, we may change circulation of the water, sediment transport, decrease wave heights, and so on. And if you had enough of this, if you had enough devices there, maybe you could even change ecosystem processes, water quality, food webs, etc. However, we know with small numbers of devices, like the number in the water right now, that you can't even measure these changes. They're too small against the natural variability. So we use computer models to get a handle on this. And the modelers, of course, put in tens and hundreds of devices in order to get their models to react. So maybe we'll have to look at this again once we get many, many devices in the water. But at the moment, it seems like a very low manageable risk. The last one I want to mention is displacement or barrier effects. Here we are concerned that by putting a whole lot of, in this case, the picture here is the west coast of the US with a whole lot of wave devices put in there, and the north migration of gray whales, which is usually quite close to shore within 5 kilometers. Those whales may be pushed further out to offshore or into shore. We don't understand what differences could make to their survival. Similarly, you may have cables or devices that crab or lobster might not want to cross. We just don't have enough in the water to be able to understand these kinds of risks yet, which is why we see it as a slightly higher risk. And that's something that's going to have to be looked at as we get more devices in the water. So that's all the bad stuff that can happen. What are we trying to do about this? Under OES Environmental, we have been trying to understand and put forward this idea of risk retirement. By this, we mean that for certain interactions, the risks are small and don't need to be fully investigated at every new project. Say you've got 1 or 2 devices. Instead, we need to rely on what we already know from permitted projects, from research studies, from other industries. And this can assist our decision-making and sort the perceived from actual risk. It's important to note that a retired risk isn't dead. It can be brought back as we pathway for carrying this out. The whole only point here is that we're trying to put together a systematic way to apply this and to apply the information that's available. And that's what those various lines and so on say. So what have we done so far? We have looked at a number of these risks and consider that they can be retired for 1, 2, 3, 4 devices, small numbers. We can't say much about large numbers. Habitat change, we can deal with careful siting. Underwater noise, we understand, and as we measure the output from turbines and WECs as they come on the market, we can understand whether they are likely to cause harm. Electromagnetic fields, they're very small coming out of marine energy devices. And changes in oceanographic systems for small numbers of devices, they simply aren't measurable. So what do we do to try to move the industry forward? The biggest one from the research point of view is we need more devices in the water. We can't collect data or test hypotheses or validate our models without that. And we need to systematically share information. I'll mention Tethus again in a minute. We have developed this organized way to transfer data and information, this risk retirement process, and we have to do it in a deliberative, organized manner. We do a lot of outreach to regulators trying to kind of get this point across. But finally, we have to translate the science we're doing into regulatory guidance, make it easier, both for the regulator and the developer to get through those processes. So we've developed yet more sets of things. We call them guidance documents. Don't need to worry about the details, but we are translating our scientific evidence into regulatory bins that make sense. Because this is an international program, we look at this broadly across, and most countries have similar kinds of laws and regulations. The details differ. We've done that as a general background. We've also done that more specifically for a number of countries and are working on others. And we've done them specifically for each of these retired risks. And all that stuff is available online. So I did mention OEAS Environmental, just a quick plug there. We are a task under the International Energy Agency's Ocean Energy Systems, 25 countries that come together. Right now we have 16 countries participating in this, and the US is the lead, the Department of Energy, and it's implemented by our laboratory. And our latest output is this 2020 State of the Science report, which is available online. It's a huge tome. It's 300 pages. As of when it came out in September 2020, we think it's everything we knew at that point around the world. And one other thing I want to mention is Tethus, which is our knowledge management system for environmental effects of marine and river energy. It also supports wind energy, offshore and onshore. There's about 7,700 documents, papers, reports, etc. Also archived webinars and many other pieces that would be helpful to you if you're interested in the topic. We put out a bi-weekly blast with mailing list with what's new, events and and news, etc. So if you're at all interested, the QR code will take you there, or tethus.pnnl.gov, and I think you'll find it really useful, including any of the students who are online. Okay. So I want to just wrap up here because I probably run long. So what does this mean for ocean and river energy in Alaska? All these things I've thrown at you. We know the resources in Alaska are amazing, both wave, tidal, and river energy, just incredible resources. But there's also amazing living resources that really need protection. We need to protect the livelihood for those who make a living from the ocean, but we also need to protect those resources for their own, these populations and habitats for their own value. So what we will need is more information, detailed information on marine populations and the habitats, and also the uses of the ocean. Portions of Alaska I know are well studied, many portions are not, and this becomes vital if you're trying to protect what's there. Stakeholders, this is for everybody, and meeting with and listening to stakeholders early and often is the biggest piece of advice I can give to a developer in particular, trying to understand what's necessary. And I know you'll hear much more about that in the rest of this panel. And finally, I hope I've given you the idea the permitting process is pretty complicated. So if I were a developer, I'd make sure the one thing I had money for was to hire a good consultant to get me through that process. That becomes incredibly valuable. And that's it. I want to thank you very much for listening. I'll look forward to questions later on and cede the floor. And I'm always happy to hear from anybody with questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And we'll go right into the next speaker here. I'll give a quick intro. Alexana is the president of the Egeluk Village Council. She was born and raised in Egeluk village. She carries a dual bachelor's degree in Native American Studies and Anthropology, as well as a master's degree in rural development. She raises her 4 young children and oversees the village projects such as the RibGen Hydrokinetic project. Alexana, thanks for joining us.
Guyana Jeremy Chimay Unok Chikini Chikichi Apapi Gaina Kwash Gasagatstun Alexander Salmon Iriakamiunga. Very nice to be here and good to see familiar names. The title of this workshop, Going with the Flow, amused me because all of my life with my last name is salmon, and being on this Kwijak River so rich with salmon, I was always told, can't you just go with the flow? Anyway, I do come from Egeluk, which is a community of about 70 people in Southwest Alaska. Our river feeds into Bristol Bay, which has the largest wild run of sockeye salmon in the world. So in our community, fish come first. This is a picture of our family at fish camp, what we've done every summer our whole lives. But our people have lived here for over 8,000 years continuously, and their survival depended on this fish resource. And so we take stewarding our lands and waters very seriously, and we look at our transition to clean renewable energy as another step in reducing our carbon footprint and becoming even better stewards. I like to start and share with other communities that our self-governance has a lot to do with what we're able to accomplish and the why behind what we're doing. A lot of our project was highlighted in the videos, and so I think I can shorten some of the technical aspects of this presentation today. But I've stressed to a lot of communities that in 2004, our river was studied as an ideal river for hydrokinetic power. And then it was a matter of finding the funding and doing the permitting and finding the right partner. And I have a very stable tribal government. For example, I've served on it for well over 10 years. And I think you need that stability to really move a project of this magnitude forward. Also, Egeluk Village is the federally recognized tribe and the only form of government, and so we own the electric utility. So this makes navigating the bureaucracy and also applying for the funding opportunities a lot easier, in that we're approaching this transition as an exercise of our self-governance, but also we're the stakeholders and part of the development team. So I just share that governance has a lot to do with an ability to, stable governance has a lot to do with an ability to undertake such a large project. The writing on the wall, the reason that we started heading towards this journey of sustainability, even before the word sustainability was all the rage. We live in a community where it's very difficult to access. We have geographical challenges. So our fuel prices continue to go up. Once we couldn't get it from barge delivery anymore. We have a limited sized runway. I mentioned that there's only 2 fuel delivery companies by air that can service a runway of our size, and they're flying, older airplanes, and they're just not is reliable. And so there have been situations where communities in our region have run out of fuel, and then it just increases the cost drastically. Also, there's just no end in sight. It raises the cost of living. There's no solution, no long-term solution with this reliance on diesel. So I mentioned our very high energy costs are due to having to fly it in small increments. We're not unique in that we're a remote, one of the hundreds of microgrids in Alaska, and there is no major electrical source, even if extending a distribution line were an option. Another thing that I like to mention is our power plant is situated by the water, because historically, when water levels used to be higher and there were special barge services, we would receive the winter supply of fuel in the fall by barge. And what we've seen for our 65 kW generators. It takes three. We have 3 generators. We can run our community on 1 or 2, depending on if it's summer or winter loads. We use about 25,000 gallons of diesel per year. Our fuel farm can hold 114,000 gallons, and it's situated here at the headwaters of this salmon run and a water source in which feeds the community. So with climate change, we have seen really amazing storm events. In 2012, for example, we had oversaturated soils, very, very high winds, hurricane force winds. And what happened was this entire bank sloughed into the river within the inside of the bulk fuel farm gate. And it created a lot of headache in finding emergency funding to put up a sheet over 200-foot long sheet pile wall to protect the water from this bulk fuel farm. And I bring it up because I hear about bulk fuel farms eroding into water sources all across Alaska. And it's not brought up so often, the costs associated with that, when we're talking about offsetting diesel costs. For some reason, it's not usually part of that equation. And these are old figures from 2018. If anything, the prices have continued to increase. Heating oil is over $6 a gallon and gas is over $7.80. And what we're seeing with global events right now, there's a lot of fear in the region I live in that fuel will be unaffordable in the future. So our electric rate is nearly $1 a kilowatt hour, but we're able to afford it because of the power cost equalization subsidy. And a lot of our cost of fuel, we can't actually bring down that cost because we are reliant on whatever the market is, and then these 2 airlines that are willing to fly with their aging airplane fleet. And I mentioned climate change, but we are also not unique in that we're a northern community in Alaska paying 5 to 10 times what the average American pays for electricity. But when we talk about no end in sight, I like to bring up the northern communities being the most exposed to climate change. So the barge deliveries became unreliable because every year the water depth would fluctuate and it was never a guarantee. And it started becoming lower and lower water in the fall that could allow for these barges to navigate our river. And then we just have the climate change, which is causing erosion problems all over. So Marek Jakinski with Ocean Renewable Power Company presented yesterday, and I was able to listen in. So a lot of these are slides I'll just breeze over. Here's our little village. The word Egeluk is from the Yupik word Iriraraq, which means like water down the throat, and it denotes where the lake, Alaska's largest lake, which is Lake Iliamna, flows into the Kvichak River. And if you see my video background, that is not an ocean, it's frozen Lake Iliamna. Anyway, we have a barge landing where we can assemble the RivGen and then float it down the river to the project site. And that's where we're located. When we were identified in 2004 as an ideal river, it was because this upper mouth of the Kvichak doesn't typically freeze in the winter. I've seen it freeze twice in my lifetime, and before it was very, very rare. But the fact that I've seen it 2 times in my lifetime, this could be climate change. You know, we don't have long enough track record of what's happening at the moment. But it has little debris. It is one of the longest studied rivers in Alaska for its salmon smolt out migration. And we've had a large presence for counting and forecasting the return adult sockeye salmon because of the commercial fishery associated at the Bristol Bay. So my least favorite topic, environmental and regulatory. Also, I'm definitely no expert, but I did see yesterday there was the question about the FERC permitting process and what Dr. Andrea just spoke about with finding a consultant. Either find a consultant or find a partner that can, especially if you're a small community like Egeluk, where we're running all facets of community life and on the developing team trying to transition to clean energy, we're just spread really, really thin. And so the navigating the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission permit process would not have been feasible with our capacity if we did not have this partnership with ORPC. So 2009, we began the preliminary permit app. 2015, we got the draft license application. 2018 was the final app, and 2019, the pilot license was awarded, for the next 10 years. So we're the first tribal entity to hold that license, and it's because of the bureaucracy, it's because of the process in that being granted. I'm not sure if this is part of the whole story, but I learned that at the National Hydropower Association conference that it just seems America hasn't, they permit a small project like this where we have an inobtrusive device in the bottom of our riverbed that is permitted on the level of a dam, is how I equate it to. So we've a fish monitoring and adaptive management team planning has been a lot of our workload here. We've had millions of sockeye salmon, sockeye smolt transiting past the device. At the moment, we haven't observed any injuries or mortalities. And the community was the most concerned about ice and the smolt because the fish come first. We already knew the adult returning sockeye salmon swim around the device. They stay closer to shore. But when we were looking in 2004 and 2007 at an in-river hydro device, we were still experiencing normal winters where everything would freeze up and we had one breakup. With the rapid climate change we're experiencing now, you don't know if Lake Iliamna will freeze. Some years we've had 2 breakups. And then this winter we had a regular cold winter with an early spring, breakup is already happening. In the past, the ice used to break up in May when the smolt outmigrated. So the whole idea was just pull the device out for a couple months of the year and let the smolt go and let the ice go. But we had to really adapt to the changing climate in the time that we've even developed this project. So also with Dr. Andrea's presentation and just looking at all the species the ocean environments have to accommodate for, we're pretty lucky in Egeluk in that the salmon are the only species that we are concerned about with our device. We have seals, they don't typically swim past. Nothing else that I know of has been caught on the cameras except for sticklebacks. Other than these fish, but we've not had any large, the beluga don't typically swim up this far. So we've been relatively fortunate in just that. And then here's our community. When we talk about community engagement, that was another question I saw from yesterday. Managing the community's expectation was one thing. When we received the first amount of funding to develop this project and get off diesels, it was a considerable amount of money for our community, and there was the real feeling of we're going to transition overnight. But it's a very long process. And then the permitting part was out of our control. And so all of the first funding we ever received as the community went towards opening up our river to permit it for devices to test and for us to select a partner. This is how you navigate, I think, being a small community with the limited amount of funding options there were at the time that we were looking. But part of that has been educating the community that this is an emerging technology that we've now brought to a proven technology. It's completely different than buying in solar and putting that on your house and running electricity, something that's been proven. So over this time span, we've brought it to a proven technology and have made that step in that we only want to work with ORPC in this hydropower. And our community has come together for decades with planning. So initially in 2001, the community said we were going to make alternative energy a #1 priority, a top 3 priority of the village. And we've continued to check back in 2010, is this still the priority? And then in 2019, in partnership with NREL and Levi and his team, Levi Kilcher, who you saw in that video, and his team, we were able to complete a next round of comprehensive energy planning. So that was just adopted. And it's been important to bring the community in as stakeholders and engaged in our project. Part of that too has been that ORPC has contracted with Alaskan-based companies and with tribally owned companies for the deployment of this device, which has only helped with that local involvement has only helped with looking at ownership, growing capacity to operate and maintain this device into the future. And the grid integration was talked about yesterday, and I know we're running up against the clock here. So featured here is the RivGen 1 getting swapped out, RivGen 2.1 getting put in from the barge landing. Currently, the first RivGen is being refurbished, and then we'll eventually have a 2-system array. And down here at the river is a picture of the shore station being put in, which is a conics, and then it feeds directly into our buried line distribution system. And this slide was also shown. The idea will be that these 2 RivGen systems will feed this smart grid, and we have a battery energy storage system, which I'll show a picture of too, that will hopefully allow us to go diesels off. This part of the project, the battery system hasn't been fully integrated at the moment. We needed a generator upgrade. That was one community expectation we weren't aware of, like I wasn't aware of, that our generators still have to be up to speed and primed in the event that they need to be turned on so that they're not cold started. So we're working on upgrading the powerhouse in addition to, and COVID of course interrupted our supply chain, and we didn't want to be messing with our generator system in the winter, so we just paused things until spring. But this is a battery energy storage system rated at 253 kilowatt hours. The 2 RivGen devices are rated around the 35 kW. We will eventually, if they're both running at capacity, be able to go diesels off. I was really humbled and amused with our with your trivia question, Jeremy, on where's the first place with the tidal 1 megawatt. Our village is so small, we're far from 1 megawatt, but this will definitely allow for a sustainable path forward. I'm not going to worry about the video because it was featured multiple times, but it's the longest operating river hydrokinetic project in the Americas. And our concluding thoughts, I spoke a little bit about weather and seasonality, as well as putting this in during an ongoing pandemic has impacted project timelines. Finding a partner that put the priority of the community worrying about ice and smolt first was very important, because if we don't feel comfortable that this can operate in our conditions, then we will not want to move towards an eventual ownership arrangement of it. And climate change really changed that course, because like I said, we were planning on coming out of the water, and now we decided to make the device as robust as possible to survive all of that, meanwhile not impacting our smolt population, which for the large part outmigrates over a short window of time and over the top of the device. We have our project team meets every week. So communication has been key, and we've met every week for years. And that goes back to the stable governance that has allowed the project team on the Egeluk Village Council side to stay constant and stable. The other 2 things, interconnection will never go as you plan. I would say nothing in this would ever go as we plan. There are way more challenges, but every time we have a success, we're sure to celebrate it. It's the little victories. And there's a lot of research that needs to be done. And we've also partnered with University of Alaska Fairbanks, University of Washington, any opportunities we have, we've partnered with academia, as I feel that's a really good partnership. And I'm just going to end it there because we're at time. But Brianna, very much for having us.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So next up is Baxter Egeluk Bond. Baxter is a research professional here at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power and the Pacific Marine Energy Center. Baxter is Yupik from the village of Tununik. He received a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering in 2018 and a Bachelor of Arts in Yupik language in 2017. So both of his degrees are from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he's been working with us since. Bax, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Just getting everything set up. So I'm Bax, and as Jeremy said, I'm a research engineer from Tununik. So the title of my presentation and what I'm going to be talking about is the economic and energy feasibility of installing wave energy converters in Yakutat. And I did this research from spring 2019 to spring 2021. So some of the numbers that you'll see here are a little bit outdated. So why Yakutat? So Yakutat is one of many villages or towns that are only using diesel for power generation. They are using 3 diesel gensets, 2 900 and 1 1300 kilowatt, and their max load is around 1100 kilowatts, which is in September. The fuel price that I used was $2.65 a gallon. This was in 2020, and they use about 470,000 gallons per year. All of that is barged in, and just fuel costs are around $1.25 million per year. And the nice thing about Yakutat is that during the winter, it has a really high wave energy density in the Gulf of Alaska. And then during summer, it has a high solar resource. So we're hoping that these two energy sources have some sort of synergy. So why use wave power? Obviously, diesel only is very expensive, and the local topography prevents conventional hydro. If you look at the map here on the right, these fjords are brackish, so conventional hydro isn't an option. And then it's located in a very heavily glaciated area of the state, so the rivers are very high in sediment. And also because it's located in a mountainous area, there are very turbulent winds that prevent conventional wind. A very recent study by a colleague has shown that all renewable energy technologies are expected to become more economically feasible. So solar and wind. And this is because as technologies mature, we optimize and we lower costs. So some limitations: transient responses are unknown. So these transient responses are on the order of 20 seconds, which is a relatively long wave period, down to sub-milliseconds, which is at the grid level. The same colleague that did the study on the cost of renewable energies also simulated at the sub-millisecond level and found that there could be possible electrical ripple from these wave energy converters, which can cause variations in frequency at the grid level. All of the power surfaces that I'll be talking about are simulated, so they aren't real world data. And then the wave energy simulations that I did, they tend to underestimate wave energy. What that means is, for example, if a storm comes through Yakutat, the simulated wave energy from that storm is probably going to be lower than the actual values. WECs are very much in development, And there is some mathematical constraints that we can't work around when we're trying to forecast waves under 5 minutes. It's like if you take a photo and you start zooming in and you get to the pixel level and you get to a single pixel and you try to zoom in even more, you're still looking at the same pixel. Yeah, so there are a bunch of limitations. Try to keep these limitations in mind as we move forward. So there are 6 different kinds of wave energy converters. The kind that we were looking at, there were 3 point absorbers, AOE, surf power, and wave bob. And then the 4th was a oscillating water column, BBDB. Say that 5 times fast. BBDB stands for backward bent duct buoy. So here is the simulated sea state in Yakutat. These blue dots are hourly wave environments. So significant wave height is roughly equivalent to the swell. Swells are waves that come from far away, and swells are what WECs are designed to extract energy from. And the energy period is just roughly the period of those swells. These colored lines are the operating areas of each of the different WECs. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but as you can see, most of the wave environments are in this upper left corner. So how did we try to find the feasibility? We used something called Homer, which is an exhaustive search simulator. What that means is that it's going to find every single combination of a system, simulate it for 20 years, which is the lifetime that we chose, and then find the cost of that system over 20 years in net present value. So in today's worth money. In this case, we had roughly 150,000 different possible systems, and it's an energy balance only modeling system. What that means is that it looks at what energy is needed at the grid, takes what it can from renewable energy sources, and then fills in the rest with diesel. Because we don't know the costs of WEC, we artificially matched the levelized cost of energy to solar. What that means is that solar and WECs, those aren't competing technologies. So that optimizes towards the most diesel offset. So we added solar cells, battery banks, and those 4 WECs that I mentioned. We have 2 different kinds of resource, observed and solar. We have 2 different kinds of resource, observed and simulated. The observed resource was solar and load, which we got from AVEC, and there was a met station installed in Yakutat for 1 year. And then the simulated resource was the waves. Here are the results. So the base case, its simulated LCOE over 20 years was 43.8 cents per kilowatt hour with no renewable fraction. With just solar, nothing else, it performed almost exactly as the base case with a 1% renewable energy fraction without a battery, and then with the battery, it actually performs worse than the base case. With just the wave bob, both with and without batteries are slightly better than the base case. But with the addition of a 600 kilowatt hour battery, we were able to achieve 37% renewable energy fraction, which is way higher than the 13% without a battery. For surf power, the battery was the deal breaker between performing better than base or performing worse than base. So 2 surf power units plus a 900 kilowatt hour battery, really high renewable energy fraction at 45%, and the cheapest system so far. Now, if we look at all of the renewable energies plus a battery, we are able to be at 43.2 cents per kilowatt hour. Versus without a battery, it's way more expensive than the base case. And we are able to achieve a really high renewable energy fraction at almost 60%. So these are heat maps from all of the renewable energy resources plus the battery from that best case scenario. So solar is pretty much what you expect. It outputs power during the day. The highest output is roughly around the 90th day of the year. And then next is WaveBob. Although it doesn't often output its max energy, it seems to always be producing energy versus the surf power WEC, which either is producing a lot of energy, 1400 kilowatts, or not producing energy at all. And then finally, the battery. As you can see, it's being very heavily used when there is high wave energy output. It's being charged and discharged a lot during the winter months. So from roughly the 270th day to the last day of the year, and then the first day to the 90th day of the year. So let's talk about this. So synergy does exist at multiple levels between WECs and between solar. So you might have noticed that the best system only has 2 WECs versus the 4 that I started with. The AOE and the BBDB, anytime those were included in the system, it always performed worse than the base case. There was no combination of battery, solar, or other WECs that made those WECs work for Yakutat. And because we ended up with 2 WECs that are good for Yakutat, the power surfaces of the WECs and their respective spectrum responses, those are non-trivial and need to be thought about. And then finally, batteries tend to determine the feasibility of the system. So if there isn't a battery, it's probably not going to be feasible. Finally, some conclusions. With an energy balance model, we know that the energy is there, but we need to be able to store that energy in the form of batteries. And again, this kind of really surprised me, is that no singular source of energy can offset the most diesel. It needs to be a combination of solar and of 2 different kind of WECs and a battery, which gives us a system that is greater than the sum of its individual parts. Finally, different WEC designs might offer the best full spectrum response, which means that you need different kinds of WECs to extract the most energy out of a wave energy system. And then because we found that different WECs have synergy in a different wave energy environment outside of Yakutat, different WECs may need different WECs might be the most optimal for a different wave energy environment. For example, Yakutat has a steady state spectrum, which means that waves have been evolving over the course of the ocean for a long time. And that is contrasted to a non-steady state spectrum, which is still trying to get into that steady state. Finally, remember the limitations I had at the beginning of this. So gas is obviously more expensive. So that might mean that that probably means that these new solar resources and wave resources might be more economical now than they were back when I did this study. Here are some data sources and tools that I used. And big shout out to MHKit, which came from NREL. Those are IEC compliant tools, which is great. And some acknowledgements. City and Borough of Yakutat, Bryson Robertson, down at OSU, Resolute Marine, ONR, AEA, ERDC, Sandia, BOEM, and DOE. And that's all I got.
Great, thank you very much, Bax. We'll transition into questions from the audience. So the chat has been pretty quiet, so I will throw out some questions. There was one question from in the Q&A, and that was, I think this has been addressed, but this one is for Andrea. Are there lessons learned from wind energy regulation, both for reducing bureaucracy and environmental studies or other risks?
I did answer that one in writing, but I think the gist of it is, I wish there were. We have very complicated processes in this country, and we're seeing as offshore wind is growing, they are running into exactly the same problems. The mix of agencies differs a little, but it's really similar to what we're seeing in marine and ocean and river energy. I think there's thoughts that because land-based wind has gone ahead so much faster and easier, that we could learn from that. But the fact of the matter is, those quick wind farms that have gone up on land have been on private land or in certain states, and they have managed to circumvent a lot of these processes. My real wish is that we could do some kind of consolidated permitting process for offshore renewables or any of these sort of similar projects. This has happened in the UK, and it's really made a difference. So we try to learn. We do stay very close to offshore wind, but same problems.
Thanks, Andrea. And I had one for Alexandra, but you answered that one. It was about the timeline for the RibGen project. I guess, would you just comment a little bit on that? I mean, it took a long time. Is there some advice you would advise for companies that are thinking about trying to replicate this elsewhere?
I think ours took a long time because of the price tag associated with it, and the funding streams were being developed. Once we went from emerging for the state of Alaska, there was nothing to fund it proven, and there was a gray area in there, and then we became part of the DOE funding competition. So how do you design a project where it can be completed in stages versus the whole thing when you're doing this? But I wanted to go back, that permitting really was a heavy lift for our team. And I know from the Secretary of Energy and Senator Murkowski came to the Hydropower Association conference, and they talked about permitting reform. And a few of the circles we've sat in on have been the tribal consultation with the FERC process, because they could really, for tribes across the nation and especially Alaska villages, they can do a lot to improve that. And we're hoping to make it more user-friendly. So we've been actively commenting on all the platforms. I know they're talking about like an integrated permitting with the different interagency department. So I think we're headed there. It's just going to be part of that long process. But we feel the responsibility of that pretty strongly, in that we have been funded so much by the feds and state and private funding, that it's really our responsibility to help make the process easier for other small communities, especially.
Great, thanks. And then this one I think is maybe for Alexandra and Andrea as well. Andrea, you had kind of a lot of inputs on the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, but I didn't see one specific to community input. Is there a spot for that in that process?
I would be happy to quickly address that, and I should have been a little clearer about that. NEPA requires, as do the state versions as well, a great deal of stakeholder and ownership input. And in this case, the tribes, the governments, and the the citizens organized groups. And that's a whole field of both study and obviously capabilities that, again, I would put that under the get yourself a good consultant, or as Alexana said, a good partner that could really work with you on that. Absolutely. It's not sort of our shtick as much, but we believe very strongly in working with the stakeholders early and often, being extremely transparent, trying to provide both the research that we know, what we don't know, and also listen to that input. So yes, absolutely. But Alexana could talk to that a lot better than I can.
This really goes back to Igiagi being the only government, and then the stakeholders. Definitely that ownership, self-determination attitude, like this is what our village has determined we want for our future. And managing the expectations of that, rather than look what somebody's trying to do to us again. So, prove this technology. I really, we have the authority, and so exercise it. And that means all the way, ideally, Igiagi will be in control of shutting off the device, and we are, but I would rather Igiagi determine when the smolt are out migrating than an agency that says, well, they probably, out migrate during this 2 weeks period of time. No, they usually, 1/4 of their population will go out in one night. So just to keep us like flexible and have that authority, that's something that I really strive for. But it is a crazy amount of permits. I think some of our federal ones were Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, and then FERC. At the state level, the State Preservation Office, and we're doing this project within an archaeological district. So we've had to have an archaeologist on part of this work, and they have a consultation process. So broadly, there's like opportunity to comment, and then very specifically under different permits, the community, the corporation, everybody has an opportunity to comment, and communication really is key. And Igiagi itself doesn't have the capacity either to hire like a full-time communications, but ORPC does. And so in recognition that we might be working during a time when all of the Bristol Bay fleet, vessel fleet, are transiting from Cook Inlet over the mountain, down Lake Iliamna, and in the river, putting up clear markers for them, contacting the radio station, using word of mouth, because we don't want to have an incident and have the larger public complaining on a project the village is really implementing. So that engagement has been crucial for just Igiagi itself, and reminding us that this is our project and we have control over where it goes, not another thing being imposed on our people. And then the at-large, I'll never forget when we initially started talking about the RivGen, and even when we shipped it out here, people were like, they're damming the river. And that's not, it's just misconception, and word spreads fast. So just managing that.
Great. I'm going to shift over here to Bax. There are a couple of questions in there for you. Bax, looks like Pat was asking about the bottom-mounted flappers. That's my crude way of putting it. And I'm sure Bill Stobby's groaning in the background, but did you look at that type?
Yeah, we did very early in the project, and those were at 8-meter depth. And all of the WEC that I presented on are at the 40-meter depth, which is roughly 130 feet. And we found that there is just way more energy at the 40-meter depth than at 8 meters. So yeah, we did initially, but we found that the energy is at the deeper water.
Great, and I'll add there, we also lost a couple moorings when we put them shallower. So it's an active area of sediment movement so I kind of shied away from the flappers in that case. Then we've got a question from Bill Lady for Alexandra and Bax in regards to whether you're tracking progress in ammonia energy storage for potentially using, well, marine energy converters to produce hydrogen.
No, not at the moment. We wanted to look at mature energy storage options. So the batteries that were in my presentation were lithium ion, just something that's pretty mature in technology. And just to add on to that, adding ammonia storage just adds another unknown of costs, because WECs are unknown in cost, and I'm not aware of how much it would be to have that sort of facility out in Yakutat.
Thanks. Oh, and I guess we're running into the break here, which I think is okay. One more question for Alexandra. Do you think your success is replicable in other areas of Alaska?
I do, because I'm an optimist, and I really feel like there was no end in sight with the diesel path, and that it would just grow worse. It has been very important for our battery energy storage system to be able to accommodate and integrate other sources of renewable energy. I believe in diversified economies. I believe in a diversified renewable energy portfolio, and I believe all the people on all the projects can work together. And so that's been, sometimes they speak another language and I'm not understanding it, but I make sure all the engineers are in the room, and that we recognize there are times when the river will flow, have less velocity, and we do have a wind source and we do have a solar source. So just keeping options open and having an integrated system, and that there is no cookie cutter solution. Government is not going to wake up one day and say, this is what's going to work and we're going to roll it out, because all of our communities are different and unique. And instead of a challenge, let's look at it as a blessing. We have great opportunity at diversity here. So yes, short answer, yes.
Great. I think that's a great place to wrap it up and give you guys a break. So thank you very much. Enjoyed it quite a bit. So that's the end of our session. I'd like to thank the speakers again for taking the time to present on the workshop and fielding questions. We'll now head into, it's about an 11-minute break. During that break, there'll be some slides advertising the Arctic X event, Sustainable Energy Conference, and then the two remaining workshops in the series, the Hydrogen in the High North. I'm seeing the chatter in the comments about hydrogen, so it's definitely a hot topic, but we are having a workshop on that. Hydrogen and hydrogen carriers, and I'll highlight that for Bill. Ammonia being one of those. And then we'll have the beneficial electrification workshop as well. So during the break, we'll have another video, and this one I'm going to warn you. It's from the CBS program Mission Unstoppable, so it's definitely geared towards younger audience, and it's pretty high energy, and there's a rather loud pink outfit in there, so just a warning. But it highlights work being done by our graduate student here at UAF, Emily Browning, to understand the performance of turbines in Alaska conditions. And with that, we'll go into the video, and then we've got a few minutes break, and we'll reconvene at 10:15.
I don't know about you, but I could go for a little more science right now. Just a bit. Roll the tape! Powering a small community in the middle of wild terrain, like remote Alaska, is no easy feat. While diesel fuel to power generators can be shipped into towns during the spring and summer, in the winter months, those passageways freeze up, leaving many without access to a stable source of electricity. One woman looking to solve this power puzzle is mechanical engineer Emily Browning.
in mechanical engineering is actually very creative. You don't exactly know the solution. You kind of have to brainstorm and think outside of the box to come up with a solution.
In her doctoral research with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Emily studies fluid flow. That's physics speak for understanding how liquids or gases move and can be harnessed for electricity. You've probably seen this with wind turbines. Those work when wind pushes large blades, creating a rotational force that can be turned into electric power. But Emily works with their underwater version, known as hydrokinetic turbines.
We've been able to pull a lot of things from wind energy, but we're still learning the best ways to make hydrokinetic turbines as reliable as wind turbines.
To perfect these powerhouses, Emily and her colleagues have evaluated half a dozen designs at their testing site on the Tanana River.
So here's our turbine now. So you can see there's 4 blades on this turbine, and then you can see this blade has a really interesting shape. So it's rounded on this side, kind of like an airplane wing.
Once placed in the river, the water spins the blades, creating rotational energy which travels from the turbine through their testing system into a box that translates the energy into power, measured in watts.
Watts are what you use in your home, from like charging your cell phone, powering a light bulb, all sorts of things like that. This tells us how much power the turbine is generating, but what I'm most interested in is how fast the water is moving. That tells us how efficient the turbine is.
To measure the speed of the water, Emily relies on an acoustic Doppler current profiler. The Doppler measures the speed of sound waves as they reflect off of or go through a moving object. But the water's speed isn't the only important factor. Flow matters too.
So there's 2 types of flow water can have, laminar and turbulent. Laminar is very predictable, but it's not commonly seen in natural environments. Turbulent, however, is very chaotic and unpredictable. This is what we're working with in this river.
Once the Doppler readings are completed, Emily checks the gathered data.
Here is our laminar flow. This one's very smooth and predictable. We also get the turbulent component. Turbulent flow can cause variations in the power generation of the turbine. When you were having very low power, you wouldn't have enough energy to turn on your lights. So this is why we want to be able to predict how much power your turbine is producing in the presence of turbulent flow.
Turbulent flow isn't the only obstacle to a stable power source. Things floating in the water pose a threat too. So engineers at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power have created a kind of shield.
This is our river debris diversion. It deflects the debris. If that wasn't there, a tree could hit the turbine and take it offline.
Knowing how turbines impact the wildlife is critical too.
Here we have the inclined plane trap. So this will catch any fish that go through the turbine, and then we'll be able to collect them to see if there were any impacts. And then we can compare the different turbines to see which one had the least amount of impact. The good news is we typically don't find very many fish in the inclined plane trap. They're usually able to avoid the turbine.
The team believes their work here will soon be able to expand to the world at large, bringing clean, renewable power to the masses.
My hope is that we'll find the best turbine design possible that doesn't harm the river or the animals in it, so that we can bring energy to the people in Alaska who need it.
Welcome back, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this morning's program and the break. Now we're going to dive into the final panel of the workshop. As a reminder, during the session, questions can be submitted via the chat box and will be addressed during the Q&A immediately following the presentation. So the next panel will provide an overview of wave energy technologies, and we're pleased to have Pat Cross, Dr. Pat Cross, as our moderator. Pat is the director of the Hawaii National Marine Renewable Energy Center at the University of Hawaii, and he also oversees operations at the Navy-operated Wave Energy Test Site. So this panel, the layout's going to be a little bit different. Pat has the privileged position of overseeing a lot of WECs that come through that Wave Energy Test Site. So he'll give a quick introduction before we jump into the discussion by the panelists. Then for the 2 remaining panelists, we'll have Bill Stobbe from Resolute Marine, and then we'll have Cal Wave talking about their WEC technology. Resolute worked with UAF a number of years ago. You saw Resolute's name on the presentation by BACS. They were interested in the YACTAT wave energy project and helped move that forward at the time. Since then, they've been developing a desalination project in Africa. And then CalWave recently completed Launch Alaska's accelerator. So they definitely have a strong interest in Alaska. So we're pretty pleased that they can make it. With that, I'll hand it off to our moderator, Pat Cross.
Thanks, Jeremy. Am I audible?
We can hear you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, actually, I communicated with Sarah earlier this morning, and we're going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to just provide a short verbal only introduction at this point, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bill Stobbe. He's got another commitment at the top of the hour, and I wanted to be sure he didn't end up squeezed. So we'll get his talk about their efforts in Alaska in. And then I'll jump into what you mentioned, which is kind of an overview of what we're doing in Hawaii. It's you may think not relevant to Alaska, but I happen to think that pretty much everything we've tested to date and plan to test in the near future could be relevant to Alaska. So I'll go through that, and then we'll let Dan Petkovich wrap up, tell us about what good things CalWave is doing. And then we should have I hope, a little extra time, maybe relative to some of the other panels for some Q&A at the end. So we look forward to that. And with that, Bill, if you're ready to go, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Pat. I assume everybody can hear me too. I'm Bill Stobbe. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Resolute Marine Energy, which is based in Boston, Massachusetts. Am I going to be able to see my own slides for the production crew there, so that I can know where I stand in the presentation, or should I open my own?
Production team here, please feel free to share your slides on your own screen. You should be good to go.
Okay. Sorry for the delay, folks. All righty. See if I can get this to go big. Can everybody see that? All right, so yeah, good. All right, so like I said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Resolute Marine Energy. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, and we, since 2007 was when the company was founded, and 2008 and 9 is when we really got serious about picking a particular technology to work with and a focus. Our initial focus was on, interestingly enough, providing wave energy power for offshore aquaculture farms, which is still an area of interest for us, but which wasn't growing rapidly enough. And so we quickly transitioned to two things. One is power for remote rural communities, and thus the connection to Alaska, and also seawater desalination applications. So those are the things that we've worked on historically. And let me go through my presentation today. It's really in two segments. The first segment is really sort of an introduction to Yakutat. Really, I'm doing this as an example of what a small community in rural Alaska did to try to tackle their energy issues, which were really, perhaps I'm overstating the case, but really strangling the economy of the city and borough of Yakutat, causing people to not want to live there anymore, and so on. So we'll talk about Yakutat and its efforts to address its own energy issues. And then basically the second part of the presentation will be how we entered the picture and what we did in the period from 2011 to 2014 as we started to develop a project there. All right, so I don't know why this doesn't move forward. I see this is let me just do this. This was automated. So this is the city of Yakutat. You're all pretty much familiar with it. Completely disconnected from any interstate grid in Alaska, very, very remote. And what a lot of people don't know is it's the center of the surfing industry. or it's the #1 surf site in Alaska. And as you can perhaps make out in this picture, has pretty good wave resource there. So that's one of the things that attracted us to Yakutat in the first place. Yakutat is, of course, Alaska Native Tribe territory, and that will play into some of the presentation later that I have in terms of the stakeholder outreach work that was necessary to be done. And this basically was what I wanted to run through. Basically, was an exercise that the City and Borough of Yakutat went through starting in 2014, actually much earlier than that, to ask the question, what are we doing at Yakutat Power to ensure safe, reliable energy at the most affordable price? And I'll run through some of the things that they looked at. So their basic goals were to be self-sustaining and be dependent on its own local natural resources for its energy supplies. It wanted to displace its dependence on imported fuel, and it wanted to clean up our environment, and it wanted to be an example for other communities to follow. So I'll actually go over this in more detail in the second half of the presentation, but these are some of the drivers of why Yakutat was so interested in exploring alternative energy resources for the community. But we've developed our own particular take on it, so we'll do that later. So at the end of the day, it's, whoops, let me go back. Its goals were basically to have a stable and core diesel plant, which was the first and foremost, that's what the community is dependent on for its power supply. And it is a very, very stable, although expensive source of energy. And that was, sort of job #1 is to make sure they have a good, solid diesel plant to supply electricity throughout all potential events. They looked around and they saw that they had a good woody biomass fuel resource nearby, and so they wanted to develop that. Next, they looked around and said, oh my goodness, we have a wonderful ocean energy resource here. So maybe we can have an energy research and development center here in Yakutat, which is fundamentally what attracted us. They wanted to take a closer look at proven and feasible solar and wind generation systems as they dip their toes into the renewable energy space. And they wanted to perhaps be an experiment center or develop alongside others alternative generation and storage technologies. They wanted to link that to their economy by expanding into greenhouses, algae farms, seafood production, biofuels, anything else you can think of where an abundance of energy might be used to build the economy in different ways. So job #1 was accomplished. This is Scott Newland, who was the general manager of Yakutat Power at the time, and one of the big advocates for this whole study. You can see that they had developed a very, very modern diesel plant with 4 brand new Cat diesels that chug pretty much 24/7. Well, actually, some of them they shut down depending on what the demand is. But so that job was taken care of. They upgraded the new distribution system, so they took care of that job as well. And then, of course, they emphasized first and foremost, which is probably #1 on most people's list, is to educate the community effectively on conservation methods so that they could reduce the demand on electricity in Yakutat. So as far back as 1962, they looked at oil and gas, and particularly natural gas resources. And this report, which I didn't see see all of it, quite frankly, basically said you'd have to drill wells that are very, very deep, and the supply was pretty much unknown. They basically said, look, let's take a look at all the various alternative energy options that we would have before us, and this is the list essentially that they came up with. They actually looked at conventional hydro at the Redfield Lake project, which I did not read this report, but there certainly is sufficient head, if you will, to have a conventional hydro project right near to Yakutat. The issue would be connecting it to the local microgrid there. A wind power study was conducted by the Department of Energy in 2005. I think the results of that there wasn't a very significant or steady wind resource in Yakutat. A solar study was done. Wasn't able to find the date as to when this study was done, but as you can imagine, for probably most of Alaska, there's significant cloud cover, which makes solar PV in particular not particularly favorable in terms of a renewable energy resource. They, of course, as I mentioned earlier, they took a look at the biomass nearby, local wood resources. Of course, there they run into sort of permitting issues with the National Forest Service, and they basically were very interested in that for a period, but didn't follow through with it. So now finally we get, they looked around, as I said, and they said, my goodness, look at this resource, a very, very powerful and consistent resource we have nearby. How do we utilize it? And the first thing that they actually looked at was a tidal project. And so again, roughly dividing marine renewable energy resources into a couple of buckets. You have wave resources, you have tidal resources, in-stream resources, which are typically permanent currents like the Gulf Stream, for example. Then you have things like OTEC, ocean thermal energy conversion. But the first thing that they looked at was a tidal project there. Then in 2009, the city basically was enamored enough by the wave resource nearby that they hired EPRI to develop a report, which basically identified the fact that Yakutat has a terrific wave resource right nearby, and they were encouraged effectively to go ahead and try and develop it. And this is where we entered. I basically attended an Alaska Rural Energy Conference in 2011. I can't remember actually that far back as to what attracted me, just knowing that Alaska had a number of remote communities that probably needed to, basically kick the habit of diesel generators. So I decided to come up and take a look. And then that led to essentially a presentation at the high school auditorium in Yakutat in 2012. Where I had a first meeting with an organization with the community effectively to explain what wave energy is, what we have done, and so on. And quickly following that, we went ahead and filed a preliminary permit application with FERC to secure control of a particular area off of the coast of Yakutat, so that any, shall we say, resources that we spent in labor and money, etc., we would be protected for a period of time, that if we ended up developing the project, we would have the exclusive right to develop that project for, again, a certain period of time. So that's really sort of the run-up to, how we got engaged with the city and borough of Yakutat. We found a very, very receptive audience there in Skip Ryman, who was the mayor of Yakutat at the time. As I mentioned, Scott Newland was also the general manager of Yakutat Power, was also a big advocate for it. Yakutat perhaps was a little bit unusual in that they had an on-staff biologist, Bill Lucy, who also was very, very enthusiastic about the idea of trying to develop a wave energy project there. And of course, we became engaged with Jeremy Kasper here and the University of Alaska Fairbanks to start consultations with how we would go about developing the project. So here is, and actually I'll pause here for a moment to go back and sort of correct something that might have been eased our introduction to Yakutat and the potential project. The DOE has established a task force, of which I'm part, which in general is to develop a guide for developing marine energy projects. It's designed, from my perspective at this point, because we're still at the early stages, to provide a guide for federal, state, local governments, and project developers to be prepared for a marine renewable energy project before selecting an individual developer or before selecting a particular technology. So it's designed effectively to give people a guide towards best practices, applicable standards, certification requirements, before engaging in discussions with little old Resolute Marine, who came up in 2011 and began pitching a particular technology for a particular project. So this is something that you can stand by for if you're interested. It'll probably be several months before that document is finished and published, but essentially it's designed to inform folks beforehand as to what they should be looking for when engaging in a process of investigating whether a particular resource, whether it's wave or tidal or in-stream, is appropriate for their technology. But so back to the, our engagement, it's very important to describe, what the problem is and why you are particularly interested in developing a particular project. So Yakutat's a small community, 650 people. They barge in fuel to run those 4 big Cat diesels that I showed a picture of earlier. I don't know what the price, but this is all historical information. Back then it was $5 to $8 a gallon, which translates into 50 to 60 cents a kilowatt of electricity cost, costing the community $2 to $3 million a year in just fuel. And then as a result of the high energy cost, the viability of a fish processing plant was threatened because the ice plant couldn't produce ice at a profit margin. So therefore, a lot of the fishing fleet would bypass Yakutat and go to Cordova, for example, to unload their catch. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant social impact associated with high energy prices, declining population. And I have to tell you, I'm pretty sure that Yakutat isn't the only community in Alaska that has that issue. So as I mentioned, the first thing we met Yakutat Power at the Alaska Rural Energy Conference. We filed a preliminary permit with FERC in 2013. Our preliminary permit was approved. For the second time around in 2013, we presented a project, a rough sketch of the project at a community event called the Yakutat Energy Fair. And then in August 2013, site analysis work began, again with Jeremy Kasper and a group from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we were funded by the Alaska Energy Authority, the city and borough of Yakutat, ourselves, and the Army Corps of Engineers to investigate the particular site. This is the site that we were looking at. It's kind of a crude, NOAA chart effectively, but you can see the Yakutat Airport there, this little L-shaped figure. And that was the area that encompassed our FERC preliminary permit. This was just a picture of the presentation in 2013 in front of the community at the Yakutat Energy Fair. And then just a couple of things in terms of the what studies were undertaken. In the beginning, University of Alaska Fairbanks deployed an ADCP, an acoustic Doppler current profiler, which basically gives us an idea of the wave resource over as long a period as we can gather data. We got a lot of interaction with National Marine Fisheries Service of NOAA to understand what the acoustic footprint of our wave energy converters would be there, because there was some sensitive habitat there. And so some passive acoustic recorders were deployed. And then we started doing some seabed surveys to understand what the mooring and anchoring situation would need to be based on the soils that would be found off of the coast of Yakutat. Here's a picture of our wave energy converter. This is just prior to a deployment at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers duct facility in on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's a hinge flap device. That flap stands up straight, and as waves go overhead, it waves back and forth effectively and activates pumps which pump pressurized seawater on shore to drive an electric generator. Very simple in operation, but complex in getting it to work correctly, quite frankly. The wheels on it basically were part of the deployment mechanism. So the idea was to wheel the wave energy converter in and out of the water for its initial deployments and for maintenance operations, et cetera. So the advantage of that type of bottom-mounted hinge flap device is deployed near shore, so you don't have long energy transmission costs associated with it, which saves a lot of money and translates into a lower cost of electricity. Good conversion efficiency, no view shed impacts. You can't really see them because the flaps remain completely submerged. There's no rapidly moving parts. There are no mooring lines into which various marine mammals and other things can get entangled. And the devices can be relatively immune to extreme loads because they can be basically locked in a horizontal position and basically ignore the overhead turbulence that's going on. So we examined 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sites for interconnection with the Yakutat mini grid. We ended up choosing one, and this is basically how the interconnection would have worked. This was a preliminary schematic, essentially, of what the project would look like in total. So you can see that there's the offshore components and then the onshore components in terms of the generating assets, and of course the power conditioning equipment that connects to the grid. And this was from a preliminary perspective where we thought we could get an LCOE roughly at 26 cents per kilowatt hour. It's not to say that there weren't some issues that would be significantly challenging to overcome. This is not a really great picture, but you can see this was taken in winter. And essentially what happens is a significant portion of the shoreline where the inland of where the wave energy converters would be deployed goes back and forth from winter to summer. In winter, you can see that a lot of the shoreline is eroded, and that all goes out into the ocean and could potentially bury our wave energy converters. So in the summertime, it all comes back, not all necessarily, but so you have the opposite problem coming from the different direction. Another significant issue is, of course, debris, which really is something that concerns the folks that are developing river energy technologies in Alaska. But this is just an example of something that washed up on the beach, and again, have had that rammed into one of our wave energy converters that could have caused some significant damage. So this is how we proceeded through. In 2013, as I mentioned, we began the site evaluation and environmental studies. In 2015, the system design was completed, including the civil engineering and grid intertie studies. By 2015, we had planned to have the system components delivered, having the pipe lay survey done for transmitting the pressurized seawater ashore. And by July 2015, we expected to do on-site construction would begin. And that by September 2015, we'd begin delivering electricity. Well, none of that happened. And that's because basically our funding ran out. I think that was at that particular time was a period beginning in 2012 and 13 when oil prices collapsed. Alaska Energy Authority didn't, I guess, have enough funding. And we're still very happy that they did fund us, and particularly that they provided a lot of funding to the UAS Alaska Fairbanks. Long story short, the project ended roughly in 2015 after we'd done a system design. And that's pretty much it in terms of what the process that the City and Borough of Yakutat went through, how we became engaged with them, and the progress that we made until we had to basically wave the white flag and stop the work that we were doing. So I'll stop there and turn it over. I'll actually stop sharing And there we go. We're back.
We're back. Thanks, Bill. I guess, I'm thinking, if I may take the liberty as the moderator here on this panel, since Bill will not be with us for the Q&A at the end, is it okay if we field some questions for Bill now?
Go for it, Pat. You're the moderator. Total control.
I'm fine with it too. Yeah.
Yeah. So any questions from the audience? I guess my main question for you, Bill, is if you could say anything about kind of what you're working on now. I know you're doing a lot in desalination and some potential projects in Africa and that sort of thing that might be of interest.
Yeah. So I think many of you may be familiar with the Water Power Technologies Office within the Department of Energy. A couple of years ago, developed this study called Powering the Blue Economy. And I have to take credit to some degree for pushing the DOE to do that, because wave energy, I'll go out on a limb and basically say I'm not sure that it'll ever become competitive with grid scale electricity production, particularly from PV and wind, et cetera. So there are a number of niche applications, however, where wave energy does apply. Providing power for rural communities like Yakutat is one of them. Another one, of course, is aquaculture, which I mentioned at the top of my presentation. But the one that really caught our attention was using waves to desalinate seawater for islands and developing countries, where once again, you see diesel-driven plants that are chugging away, producing desalinating seawater at a very, very high cost. And there's an opportunity for us to come in and provide a cheaper cost per cubic meter of water, which is the figure of merit, quite frankly. So we quickly focused on the African continent as a good place to start. And the first country we focused on was South Africa, but we quickly, for a variety of reasons I won't go into, pivoted to Cape Verde, which is an island archipelago about 300 miles off the west coast of Africa. Very, very dry. 85% of its freshwater supply comes from seawater desalination plants. And all of those plants are powered by diesel generators. So they have a huge addiction to diesel fuel, just like Yakutat does to power its power plants. The interesting thing about that is that water, for example, is a business model that can scale, I think, very, very rapidly. We are currently finishing up the site characterization studies with funding from one of the development finance institutions, the African Development Bank, to be precise. And we think we can produce water at around half the cost of what it currently costs in some of the communities there. So, and we think we can repeat that process of producing wave-powered desalination plants all over the world. So we've looked in markets in Mauritius, Morocco, Senegal. There's places along the Chilean coast, islands in the Pacific, islands in the Caribbean. Huge water requirements around the world and opportunities to use wave power to create the supplies that are needed. An example is Barbados, very quickly, which it's largely a touristic economy, very limited real estate space, so PV plants cannot produce enough power at an efficient use of space, of very valuable space, in order to produce significant amounts of fresh water. And there's local, shall we say, aversion to placing wind turbines on the tops of the mountains. And so an invisible power supply, like what our bottom-mounted wave energy converters can do, is an ideal, potentially an ideal solution for them. So that's pretty much what we're focused on now, Pat. And that business, as I say, I think scales very well.
Yeah, cool. Well, as you I think know, Bill, at an academic level, we're getting into OWSCs ourselves, and so we should probably talk more often.
Oh, good. Yeah. There's certain advantages to them. There's certain disadvantages to them too. But
yes,
but anyway.
well, Bax mentioned one, and Jeremy another, with in particular keeping them anchored in really dynamic environments.
Correct.
So
yeah,
that's a challenge for sure. And Alaska has plenty of those. Anything else from the audience? Okay, well, I think I will then share my screen and give you a little bit about, oh, let me make sure I'm sharing the right presentation. Okay, yeah, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what we're doing in Hawaii at the Wave Energy Test Site, and some briefly touch on some research projects we're doing in wave energy at the university that are sort of corollary to our involvement at the test site. So again, this is all Hawaii. It's nice and warm here, which I guess it's not up there right now. So it's quite a different environment in many respects. However, these wave energy devices that you see pictured on this slide, I think in every case have potential to be relevant for Hawaii. I mean, for Alaska and Hawaii. The ones on the left there are the projects we've done to date, and that includes 2 deployments each of the Northwest Energy Innovations Azura device, and 2 deployments of the Fred Olson Lifesaver ring-shaped device, both point absorber technologies. I'll get a little bit into each of these later, so I won't dwell on them in this slide, but you also see the Ocean Energy device, which is here in Hawaii. That's quite a large 500 kilowatt, it has a 500 kilowatt turbine on it. Quite a large device that is unfortunately had some damage in its transit over here, and with COVID has not been able to get into the dry dock and get repaired and deployed at WETS, but we hope that'll happen later this year. And then on the right side of the screen, you see the Oscilla Power device that is also here in Hawaii now, just arrived in the fall. And there's a few projects we need to do both to prepare the device and to prepare the site before that'll deploy, but we hope that'll happen in the spring. And I'll get a little bit more into the stuff pictured in the upper right, which just gives a flavor of some of the stuff that we do to support the test site. Before I do that, I just wanted to give, for those who haven't thought much about wave energy, and I think in Alaska, we've been talking mostly about tidal and river energy extraction with a little bit of a shift here to wave at the end. The reason we tackle wave energy, despite it being extremely difficult, is that the wave resource is vast. It's huge. Use big words. It's all those. There's a lot of wave energy out there, but it's very, very difficult to extract it in an economically viable way. As Bill mentioned, being competitive, particularly on the grid scale, with wind and solar, which are much more mature, is extremely challenging. As a community, we're certainly not giving up on that, but it's a daunting challenge. And so there are many more near-term applications that we can talk about for offshore power generation that are not grid connected. The fact that testing these devices is extremely costly, and getting into the open ocean to do this is costly. There's high value to these dedicated test sites, such as WETS here in Hawaii or EMAC in Scotland. Those are extremely valuable locations, and they are few and far between. Ours is the only grid-connected site in the US to date, although one is being developed by Department of Energy off the coast of Oregon, called PacWave. So in case you're wondering, you've seen a couple of these images already. You see the flap type wave energy converters on the left. Wave energy converters look like just about anything you can imagine. If you have 50 engineers who haven't thought about wave energy, they'll probably come up with 50 concepts. There's the attenuator type device in the bottom center. There's the oscillating water column there in the center, and the center top, one floating, one fixed to the seabed. There's the point absorber type devices that you see in the lower right. And there's several others. So wave energy conversion is early stage, lots of different ideas, and yet to really converge on optimal solutions. It's likely, in my opinion, not to be like wind, where we see a pretty widely accepted technology used around the world. Wave energy converters are likely to be much more dependent on the wave environment in which they are deployed. So shifting gears to wet specifically, our site consists of 3 test berths at 30, 60, and 80 meter water depths. We've got a couple of wave measurement buoys out there to characterize the wave resource. There are cables to shore and a grid connection on the Marine Corps base on the windward side of Oahu, the east side of Oahu. You see our shore facility, which is actually an old World War II bunker on the lower right there. And our role at the site is basically to be the logistics and research support arm of the Navy. It's a Navy-funded site with congressional backing to develop wave energy. So where we get involved is sort of being the third-party independent performance assessment agent, I guess you'd say, between the commercial developers and the government sponsors. So we, according to IEC standards, will generate a power matrix, which is power production versus wave height and wave period. We make sure we maintain those wave measurement buoys. It's very critical to have that wave input data so that we can develop that power matrix. We also do a daily wave forecast and have developed a pretty robust 40-year plus hindcast database. So we really understand the resource well, and that helps developers who may want to come to WETS to design a device according to our historical wave regime. We also do a fair amount of numerical hydrodynamic modeling of wave energy converters at different aspects of their motions, as well as their moorings, which we've learned have been quite a challenge to maintain and understand their impact on WEC device performance. So we do some of that for ourselves and for our sponsors, but also for the commercial developers. And then we're responsible for doing environmental collection around the devices. As Andrea mentioned in her talk, there's a lot of interest in the potential harm these may have when deployed in numbers. So we want to collect some of that data. Historically, we've done some sediment transport studies that didn't, to be honest, reveal a whole lot. We didn't see a lot of change. Ecological surveys, and we always do protected marine species monitoring whenever we're out to be sure we're not doing any major over-the-side activities when there are humpback whales or monk seals or sea turtles present. But really our environmental data collection has focused much more on the acoustic signatures and in recent times, and that's ongoing with Navy support now. So whenever a wave energy converter is deployed, and in some cases when no wave energy converter is deployed, we're collecting data from both fixed in the bottom left and drifting in the picture above that ways, so we can get both temporal and spatial resolution of sound that's emitted from the wave energy converters. And the graph on the right kind of shows you our finding to date in a nutshell. This is just for one device, but it sort of tells the story, and that until we get in very close, in this case about 20 meters, we can really not detect the wave energy converters that have been deployed to date above the ambient environment. So they've been pretty quiet. That's good news. So we don't expect that they're having any significant impact on marine species. But we'll continue to collect that data as larger devices and perhaps more than one device at a time get deployed. So that'll be ongoing. I won't dwell on this slide, but this is some of our Navy funds have gone into local companies, Sea Engineering, to outfit this vessel. This is actually an old retired Navy torpedo retriever, which they augmented in beam with a couple of sponsons on the side, added that A-frame and knuckle boom crane for lift capacity. It has a 4-point mooring capability, and it can host that ROV you see in the upper right with a command van on the deck for ROV inspections or light repairs and maintenance out at our deeper berths. So the 2 deep berths are obviously below routine diver depth. So that's why we need ROV capabilities. One of the projects, I'll focus on recent projects. This is the Azura. You see what it looked like in its first deployment in the top center, and then in the bottom 2 pictures show what it looked like for its second deployment, where that float was modified to be larger and a greater moment arm from the vertical spars. This was done due to power production being less than hoped for the first time around, and these were, and also a heave plate was added at the base. So these were both intended to improve the relative motion of the float versus the spars. So that went very well hydrodynamically. It did not produce additional power, mainly because no modifications were done to the PTO, but it did inform this company's advance to their next scale project, which we hope to see here at WETS in a couple of years. And then this was the Lifesaver device, which in its second deployment addressed some issues we had with the mooring lines and did so successfully. But also, perhaps more interestingly, instead of this deployment was not grid connected. So instead of just burning off power, the power was fed to this University of Washington APL developed sensing suite called AMP, which included optical and acoustic sensors, very robust system. And it got all the power it needed 84% of the time from the wave energy converter itself. So this was a pretty cool first that we know of. That would be less than 1% of uptime if you were using batteries only. So this is pretty neat, and we're pretty excited about it. Oh, and I didn't mention that the sensing suite also included a Wybotic, a small company in Seattle, wireless charging system, which also worked great. So this is something that could be used, for example, to recharge an autonomous vehicle. A couple of projects we're working on internally, or a few projects. I don't know if Bill's still here, but there's our flaps we're working on. One is a DOE funded from a FOA project we call HOSEC, the Hawaii Wave Surge Energy Converter for electrical power generation. That project is now well underway, and we're looking to test at Oregon State at our smaller scale here soon. We also entered into the Waves to Water competition that DOE sponsored with that center device. This was very rigid requirements to keep it small and rapidly deployable, and for the purpose, instead of electrical power generation, in this case for freshwater generation, thus my interest in Bill's work. So that is not currently moving forward, although we're sort of looking for opportunities to build a prototype and get it in tanks and test it. And then on the right is our floating oscillating water column wave energy converter for the purpose of AUV recharge, which has now been picked up by our Navy funds to advance and develop a power takeoff system for it. We call it Halona. named after the Halona blowhole here on Oahu, for those who may have visited. The red line is kind of where we are with the 4 devices I mentioned before having been deployed, and the Sea Power, Oscilla, and Ocean Energy devices coming soon, and a second Sea Power device coming hopefully by the end of the year. I think it's going to be into 23. And then we've got 2 more devices, Aqua Harmonics and NWI, that are still likely a 1.5 to 2 years out. So we got more good stuff coming. Here's the sort of near-term ones. That's some pictures. So Oscilla Power is in Hawaii. There it is, floating out of the dry dock on the upper left. You can see its sort of deployment strategy. This is a point absorber with, instead of connecting direct to the seabed, using that reaction ring, suspended reaction ring. And then Sea Power will do a deployment that's not grid connected. Oscilla will be at 30-meter berth. Sea Power will not be, but it will feed power, interestingly, to an AEV recharge system and to a number of sensors, including an active acoustic marine species sensing system. And then there's the Ocean Energy device on the right that I mentioned before, under construction in Portland, and then Pierside in Hawaii. And what you can't see below the waterline is some damage that still needs to be repaired. So that is it for me. There's a picture you can actually see if you look just to the lower right of the question mark there, the Ocean Energy device in Honolulu Harbor, and then the Triton Sea Oscilla Power device on to the right of the circle. So 1 picture, 2 wave energy converters, 1 city. And with that, I am done, and I will stop sharing. And I think I'll go straight to you, Dan, and then we'll field questions for both at the end.
Sure. Thank you very much, Pat. Appreciate the time and the intro. A lot of interesting stuff you guys are doing. A lot of interesting stuff Bill's doing. Quite interested in some of his work in Yakutat and what we can learn, from these past projects. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There you go. As mentioned, we're CalWave Power Technologies, originally out of Northern California, spun out of UC Berkeley back in 2014. And then just as an example of kind of adding on what some other folks have talked about, with the need for wave energy, this chart is specific to California, but you're seeing a lot of the same trends in European countries and other places that are approaching 30, 40, 50% renewables, where they're relying very heavily on wind and solar for very good reasons, but you're starting to see a lot of curtailments required. In California, even just getting into the mid 30%, they're starting to substantially have to curtail solar at times, which is just an argument for more sources of renewable power as we go towards a higher penetration. And then, Pat, it looks like we may have some of the same slides or pictures, but I'm sure we're pulling from the same report as far as the wave energy resource in the United States. As you said, it's about as massive as you can think of. It's also worth pointing out that about half of it is in Alaska. Not the easiest place to deploy technology, but there's the means and the need to get there. And then we also added on the right here to show the timing variability to where, even though wave energy, needs some time and maturity to reach grid scale pricing, it does have advantages on the grid when it comes to the timing offset between wind and solar. This grainy map that may be hard to read is a zoom in of the NREL MHK Wave Energy Atlas. It just shows that massive wave energy resource in Alaska. And it's worth pointing out that even the blue areas above the Aleutians are still 10 plus kilowatt hours per meter, which is still quite significant and does make it, have a lot more potential for more efficient wave energy generation. And then shown across the bottom, you can see that in general, Alaska pays, roughly double the U.S. average for power, which does kind of create that opportunity for some of these earlier scale technologies that would have a hard time being cost competitive, on the main grid for still some time. As an example, 1 mile of coastline could technically power 20,000 households in Alaska. At CalWave, we feel that wave energy can eventually power 25% of the global electricity, and as Bill and others mentioned, that also includes desalination and eventually hydrogen, ammonia, or other forms of energy storage. And the long-term goal of integrating with energy storage, I think, is really powerful, because when you look at some remote communities and islands and places like that have been dependent on imported power, and particularly imported diesel, for so long, in the longer term, these systems will allow them to be energy exporters. And I know in a past life, when I was working at Scotland and deployed some technology up at the EMEC test site up there, we saw they were starting to incorporate energy. They're starting to incorporate hydrogen generation from wave and tidal and wind power, and are now, they have a ferry running on hydrogen. They have the city buses and cars and other things, running on hydrogen. And I apologize, my son in the background is learning to vocalize, and is very opportune at his the times he picks to practice. So this is a picture of our device, where we think we differentiate and we can bring power, particularly to places like Alaska that are difficult places to deploy. Our system is fully submerged, but near surface, and it operates at a variable depth. So it's what's called a submerged pressure differential, which means we take it on the surface, as you see in the big picture, and then, when we go into operational mode, it pulls itself down below the surface, and as the wave passes over, it creates that pressure field that moves the device in an orbital motion that allows it to generate power from all 6 degrees of freedom, which greatly increases the efficiency. And the big added advantage to that too is that as the storms pick up, or as the seas get really rough, the device can just change its depth profile and operate at deeper depths to shed loads in the same theory as wind turbines pitching back into wind to reduce efficiency at higher powers. And it allows you to really optimize the size and scale of the device. In San Diego, we've already encountered the statistical 50-year storm, when scaled up to what that would be at a full-scale device. And we do have PNNL that we're working with, Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. They've deployed hydrophones, they've deployed underwater cameras. They have some noise acoustic stuff out there now. And similar to what you said before, Pat, they've now had to redeploy their equipment because they went to the IAC specified distance and couldn't hear anything. So we've been walking their equipment closer to the WEC just to try to pick up some sound profile. Just some more pictures of our deployment. We started this project after the U.S. Wave Energy Prize. That going back 2015-16, 92 companies participated in that prize, and then 2 companies were awarded at the end of it, with open ocean deployment contracts. That led to this project in San Diego that has now been deployed for 6 months. We're 2 weeks shy of 6 months, and so far we've had, I think, 99.8% uptime. We've only had to turn the system off a few times just to reboot software and things like that. There's lightning that shut off power at the pier that we had to reboot. Couple small events, but each time our system continued to operate offline and disconnected from the pier, and then came back online and rebooted as necessary. So the biggest things we're trying to prove with this deployment in San Diego is primarily survivability and reliability. Like I said, we've are monitoring corrosion and biofouling and trying to not clean it too much. We keep telling, we're quite lucky in the fact that the Scripps Institution of Oceanography actually teaches a diving class right off the pier. So whether we want to or not, we're getting inspections every month. So we have to tell them like, hey, like don't clean it too much because we want to actually see how this stuff grows, and we want like some of that evidence on, like there's one spot where some paint got scratched off during deployments. We're like, let's just put a camera on that and watch it and watch how fast it corrodes with and without the paint. So we can learn from that and clean things that look dangerous from biogrowth. We've had once or twice, big kelp hanging off mooring lines, and like, all right, go ahead and take care of that. But for the most part, let it grow and let's see how it affects the performance. And we have transitioned to fully autonomous controls. So the machine selects its own depth, it optimizes for performance. It also has some geometry controls where it can adjust its geometry in a holistic way to make it more efficient for different period waves and different waves that are coming in. And the installation procedures and things like that went quite quickly, and knock on wood, so far no significant issues. Going back to what I had discussed about being submerged and what that means as far as performance optimization. The heat map in the middle of the screen, to explain that a little bit, it's wave height on the vertical axis and wave period on the horizontal axis, and you can see that brightly colored spot in the middle. And this is for San Diego, but it's representative of a lot of different places are similar, just the numbers change. Where the majority of your power production is in towards that bottom left area, and that's kind of where you're really making the majority of your power. But those longer plots, 25, 50, 100 year, those are the statistical storms that you need to design for survival. So you end up with, a lot of the previous devices that have come before are more or less floating tanks because they need to survive those 50 and 100 year storms, where we've tried to optimize the capital cost by not having to survive those storms on the surface, and instead just dive to reduce the loads through depth. As mentioned, we're currently participating in Launch Alaska. Ryan Davidson is joining the panel discussion as he's been much more involved in Launch Alaska and has had a lot more interaction with the community up there. And can speak more intelligently about what we've gained through that program and what we're looking at going forward. I gave some background already to CalWave and our history. Like I mentioned, 2014, 2015, we came out of UC Berkeley with some support with Cyclotron Road and Activate, which were part of or associated with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Got the DOE award in 2016 and have since got 3 more DOE awards to build and deploy at PacWave. So first was the design for PacWave, and then the drivetrain testing for PacWave. And we recently received the largest DOE wave energy award to build a roughly 100 kilowatt system and grid connect that at PacWave when that site opens in late 2023, early 2024. And we are looking at these 100 kilowatt systems as being very relevant for microgrids on islands and remote communities. That's a main reason why we're keenly interested in Alaska. And then we are looking to move on to the megawatt scale system, which we do feel can be competitive on utility grids, but I totally accept that that's going to take some time and effort and development and volume manufacturing. And there's a lot of work to be done there. And that's where I think in the short to midterm, these 100 kilowatt systems are the target markets. We also have the X node, which to what Pat was talking about with some of these non-grid connected systems, we can take a system roughly the size of what we have in San Diego, optimize that and power it and power underwater autonomous vehicles, power offshore aquaculture and different types of ocean sensing equipment and things like that, where a few kilowatts continuous is quite useful. And we've had some advancing discussions with different pilot projects for these systems. Our team, we're still quite small. We've tried to stay small and be efficient at how we grow and where we grow. Currently 7 individuals. We are hiring a few positions at the moment with the new funding, and probably a few more next year. And we've had some great partnerships with Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Berkeley National Laboratories, and many others. On our website, we got some great media. We do have one video that I had asked to show. And like I said, if you go to the press room page on our website, there's several other videos and more information from the website. So I think that's kind of it as far as the slides go. And if you don't mind showing the video, I can talk to that as well. Do I need to stop sharing, I imagine? Yeah, so this is, you can see the device down there with some of the buoyancy modules on it. We use, this is the Scripps Institution of Oceanography boat. So we use their divers, their equipment, their boat. This is us towing out of the harbor in San Diego. This is roughly a 15 kilowatt system, and it was built at our facility. We did the drivetrain testing in UC Berkeley, and then we built the facility in Alameda up in the Bay Area, and then we're able to split it into 4 quadrants and ship it to San Diego on 2 flatbeds and reassemble and do some testing there. Nice open water tow to site. Like, we're only about 600 meters off the pier. You can see the pier in the top right, but to get to the pier, it's about 10 nautical miles of open ocean towing. So we pre-laid anchors. This is a marine protected area, so we were quite limited on the type of anchors needed. So as far as deployment goes, we just brought it up there, got it in the right position. These are the divers. They had pre-laid anchors with mooring lines. They pick up a mooring line, swim it over to us. We connect it to our system, and then move on to the next one. It took us maybe about an hour and a half for the whole deployment. Once we got on site, that was the umbilical cable shown there. Once we got on site, we sat like this for a while just to, make sure everything is do all our functions testing. Like, we did run an umbilical cable the 600 meters back to the pier. So at this point, we're talking on Wi-Fi to the shore station through TeamViewer, and then operating it through the shore station. And then, as gaining confidence, switching it back to fully remote control through the control station. And then now we're submerging it down to its operational depth in order to do some operational functional checks before taking it down further and kind of mapping the full depth range. And kind of, like I said, we waited about a month before we put it in fully autonomous mode, which was based on just wanting to kind of stepwise check out each individual function that we weren't able to test in the lab, before we gained that confidence and made that switch. And going back to visual acuity, like, once it's deployed, we keep having folks that want to come visit, and we're like, that's awesome, please come visit, but you can't see anything. You can go to the pier and look out, and we'll show you the spot in the water where the device is, but unless you're putting in goggles and going diving, there's nothing to see from shore. So we do have a Coast Guard buoy out, just letting folks know it's in the area. So I'm happy to hand it back over to Pat, and I think we could go into our panel, or let you take it from here.
Yeah, super cool.
Appreciate it.
What you guys are doing is really exciting in the community. So I'm excited to see it. So I guess we don't have all that much time. I thought we'd end up with more, but maybe I was too long-winded. So any questions for Dan and Ryan? Do you want to say something about the Alaska involvement?
Yeah. I think actually on the call today we have, quite a few people we've talked with consistently over the last 5-6 months through Launch Alaska, and I think there are some Launch Alaska team members here as well. And of course, we only have great things to say about the program. We were excited about joining Launch Alaska's tech deployment track because, as we've mentioned, Alaska does have about half of the United States wave resource, and once you take into account the, as was mentioned earlier today too, 5 to 10 times as much some of these people pay out in remote communities in Alaska, and take into account that you have to import or barge in diesel from hundreds if not thousands of miles away. I mean, this is just perfect conditions for wave energy deployment, really. And we've had great experiences, and we'll continue looking for projects around the state. We're excited about that.
Yeah, and I guess, Ryan, I apologize. I forgot to give you any kind of introduction aside from the slide that we glanced over pretty quickly with our team. But he joined us fairly recently. He's our lone Houston office member with our association with Greentown Labs down there, and wanting to kind of tap into so much of the technical capacity capability of the community down in Houston. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Good to meet you, Ryan. And yeah, does anyone want to ask Ryan or Dan anything about potential application of their technology to Alaska? Let's see, I guess I'm being told there are a few questions in the chat. Jeremy asks how large a vessel is required for the 100 kilowatt device, and what size shipping containers will it fit into?
I think we would manufacture the system locally. Ideally, we'd manufacture it locally. We'd like to avoid towing it, all the way that far. And the 100 kilowatt system would be roughly 12 meters by 12 meters, so that would be unlikely to transport by truck. But I think we can do the powertrain here locally and containerize the powertrain, and then integrate that locally. And Ryan's done some work trying to identify local partners and local locations where it could be manufactured. It's one thing about a small team is we would like to engage the community as much as we can, and do local manufacturing, local ships, local know-how, and not pretend like we know that area.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of one part of it, is we definitely want to involve the community of Yakutat as well in pursuing projects in Southeast Alaska and Yakutat, and particularly for manufacturing capabilities. If we have that capacity there, or Juneau, Sitka, Ketchikan are kind of three other places that we're looking at in the region. So I mean, kind of those big three towns down there.
And for towing, we would need maybe a 2,500 or 3,000 horsepower tug. So like a good harbor tug should be enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, certainly long distance open ocean tows are somewhat out of favor right now, and I mentioned the reason why. I think.
Yeah, I remember seeing the Scylla load up on a barge, and I was like, those guys are smart. I'm sure that's not cheap, but it's probably a good idea.
Yeah. Let's see. Bill Lady asked, how is energy integrated from multiple units? And are the wave converters wild AC to wild DC output to shoreside inverter to grid? You say something about that?
Sure. I mean, we're trying to make it as less wild as possible. We do have a lot of onboard, both mechanical and then electrical power conditioning. And then we would aggregate power on a transformer on a common bus, and export it AC. So where exactly that aggregate transformer would be located is a little bit dependent on, what a farm looks like. In larger farms, you would have a transformer on site like offshore wind, but when we're looking at 1, 2, 3 devices, that may be a different architecture.
I see one question. Do you have any planned Alaska deployments? I don't think you specifically do yet, but it looks like you're thinking about that.
Yeah, jump away, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that it's been hit on very heavily today, and that's great in Yakutat. There have been planned deployments there before, and we're interested in kind of jumping in there as well. And a big part of that too is expanding on past feasibility studies, and we'd really like to actually get involved with the community there as well. To ensure that we're meeting their needs. And beyond that, as mentioned, the Aleutians have an incredible wave resource, and in particular, there are some communities out there that pay even more than Yakutat does. So, in addition to that, as Dan mentioned, once you go north of the Aleutians, you still have a pretty solid resource up around Bristol Bay. So we would like to at least investigate the potential there. Because if you're looking at 10, 15, 20, kilowatts per meter of wavefront on average for the year, you're looking at quite a bit more than that during optimal conditions. So that's something we're thinking about as well.
Great, thanks. And let's see, what would you anticipate the maintenance requirements for your 100 kilowatt device to be?
I think at this point we're looking at a 2-year maintenance cycle, but we could do kind of inspection only during that period with ROVs, just inspection ROVs. We're validating some of that now, and then look at every other year, tow it back to somewhere and kind of access it and look at it. We would eventually expand that out to a 5-year maintenance cycle and a more commercial kind of longer term goal, but I think in the near term, we would look at probably 2 years.
2 years sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, exactly. And that
would be quite an accomplishment.
We probably wouldn't start with that. It's been quite encouraging that we haven't put a hand on the device in San Diego for 6 months. And we're looking at potentially keeping that in the water a little bit longer, just kind of for that reason, to validate what the maintenance cycles would be. And we've gotten some encouraging data on wear items and looking at kind of how some fatigue has progressed on wear items. And we do have some plans in place when we recover that device to have certain systems x-rayed to look at fatigue and to see how close we came to failures.
And I guess I have a question. You mentioned an umbilical to shore, to the pier.
Mm-hmm.
You're not transmitting power to shore, are you? Or
we are. Yeah.
We are. Oh, you are. So you're feeding it into the power grid. Is that
correct? Yeah, we're plugged into the UCSD grid. Now, granted, for a 15 kilowatt device, whenever we came up with our integration plan, they were like, "Yeah, no one cares. Just plug it in." It's not. Yeah. It's not enough power to really affect the local grid. So, we didn't get a whole lot of people concerned about plugging it in.
Well, that's refreshing as compared to the Hawaiian Electric Company integration hurdles that we have to overcome even for a few kilowatts.
Yeah. I think we, being part of the UC infrastructure and working with UCSD has been quite beneficial. We did have to get about 9 permits. That was not a small effort, but we definitely pasted the Scripps Institution name all over everything we could. And I think that was very helpful with permits. People in the area are comfortable with them, and they know that they know how to operate offshore and they know how to protect the environment and things like that. So using, boats and divers and assets and people who are already embedded in the community and people are familiar with, I think was really helpful.
Okay, very cool. I'm aware that we're at 10:30. Jeremy, do you want to take it back or?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. But thank you very much, everybody.
And there were a couple of unaddressed questions in the chat, but I think we can follow up on those.
Yeah, and we're happy to answer via email or whatever.
And I can try and farm those out to you as well afterwards.
Sounds good. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ryan. And thanks to Bill as well. So with that, we're going to shift back to have a final wrap-up session with the remaining moderators. And I think actually, Pat, there's might be only the two of us right now, but also Josie Hartley with the Alaska Energy Authority is going to join us in place of David. David was not feeling great this morning, so had to pass. So give Josie a little bit of time to get on, and then we'll take it away. Great. Hi, Josie. You want to give a quick introduction to yourself since you're new to the panel?
Sure. Yep, my name is Josie Hartley. I work at the Alaska Energy Authority with David. Like Jeremy mentioned, he wasn't feeling well this morning, so he asked if I could step in and perhaps answer any questions from the AEA perspective. I am by title the Wind Program Manager at the Energy Authority, and my background is certainly not as strong when it comes to this technology as David's. So I do apologize for that in advance, but thank you.
Great, thank you, Josie. And yeah, there's very few people who can take over from David. He's been working with these types of technologies for a long time now. So
True. Very true.
You're stepping into big shoes. So Pat, do you want to maybe start with some of your summary thoughts? Sorry to put you on the spot right away.
My summary thought. Well, unfortunately I was not able to be present during yesterday's sessions, so I don't have a lot to say. Obviously my focus is on wave energy, and I gave you those highlights of what we've been doing in wave energy, and so I guess I see wave energy as quite the untapped potential for Alaska. It is globally, and you heard all the challenges and the logistics around, building these fairly sizable devices and figuring out how to get them deployed and cabled to shore. And it's all very difficult and very real challenges, but the resource is big. The need is potentially there. I think the need for desalination in Alaska is perhaps reduced compared to Cape Verde Islands or other places that Bill mentioned. But certainly for replacing diesel electrical power generation, I think there's a lot of potential for wave energy to be considered. And obviously, you guys all know more about the river and tidal opportunities in Alaska as well. But I think there's an opportunity for Alaska, kind of like Hawaii, to be a test bed for a lot of these things. We don't have the river run and the tidal that you guys do, but we do have the waves and the solar and the wind. So yeah.
Related to that, do you see the same issues? I mean, I know residential solar in Hawaii is probably pretty limited at your ability to put more on the grid at this point. Is that an opportunity for wave energy technology?
Yeah, it's getting there where, there's a lot. I have solar on my roof, and so do many of my neighbors, and it's getting to where it's more and more difficult, depending on which local circuit you're on, to get permitted for a new solar installation. Yeah, because they're trying to maintain stability of the grid. So yes, that could be. It's a long ways off. I don't think the people who are really planning, we have a 2045 100% renewable electrical power generation goal here in Hawaii, and I don't believe that the folks who really are addressing that at the policy level are thinking in terms of wave energy as really making a contribution. But that's okay. That's okay with me, because we're not ready to make a meaningful contribution, but we're all sort of working toward that goal where policymakers will start to sit up and take notice that, hey, maybe this is something to add to our grid to complement solar and wind and even out those peaks and valleys of production, with wave energy being a bit more forecastable than wind and solar, and pretty steady year round in Hawaii. So yeah, it's a long ways off before it really is gonna become a meaningful part of our renewable portfolio. But then, that's why I'm kind of excited about these blue economy and non-grid connected projects that we're talking about, because not only do they address near-term, objectives that can be achieved in the near term, such as feeding power to an autonomous vehicle that's swimming around and collecting oceanographic data, or mapping the seabed, or whatever it might be. If you can start providing power far from shore, that opens up all kinds of interesting applications. But also, and so those are smaller wave energy converters, even 50 or 100 watts of power generation could be meaningful for certain sensors. So that's a sort of a simpler problem to attack. And you, in the process of doing so, you learn about what works and what doesn't work, that some of which can be applied to the larger scale, grid scale power production. So I see these nearer term blue economy objectives as not only addressing those applications, but just more broadly informing the wave energy community about how to move forward at larger scale. So I think I got to rambling about philosophy there, and I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I'll lead you back, but that was super. It actually ties in nicely with one theme I was noticing. So I think it was Andrea who said that one of the big missing components in kind of regulatory acceptance of these devices is that there's just not that many deployments. So I mean, in that sense, those blue economy deployments really might help move one of the legs we're missing forward. We're getting more information and getting stuff in the water.
Yep.
And you also brought up an interesting thing, and I'm not sure Josie will be able to comment on this or not, but Alaska has just proposed a renewable portfolio standards. And is this, Josie's title, something that AEA is even thinking about as a means to meet those, or is it just too new to really include in something like that?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that AEA is open to really any of the technologies that could prove to be economic and beneficial to the state. But it just does really come down to the maturity of the technology at the time, as it relates to the timeline that's been put forward in the RPS. So I'm sure that AEA would be supportive of tidal energy. However, it really just does depend on the maturity of the technology as time progresses.
Mm-hmm. I guess one comment there, one thing we have seen, I mean, and David would be fully aware of this, Ocean Renewable Power Company originally had a preliminary FERC permit, I think it was for the East Foreland site or in that area, for tidal. And I think they let that lapse. Maybe Doug is on here and he can chime in, but my understanding was at the time they let it lapse because they didn't see a realistic pathway towards lowering that cost. The fact that they have now re-upped that permit tells me that they're thinking the costs are coming down, which is a positive sign, I think. So hopefully for tidal anyway, we might be getting there. I guess on a couple of other themes, well, Colleen from REAP chimed in the chat here that there's actually a webinar on March 16th that REAP is let's see, I'm not sure that's REAP that's hosting it, but the Alaska Renewable Energy Project is hosting a webinar on the renewable. Oh yes, REAP is hosting renewable portfolio standards. So that's in the chat there. Then I know it's been a hot topic for a lot of interest for folks who are paying attention to energy in Alaska at this legislative session. I guess I'll swing back with a few more highlights from what we heard. Pat definitely highlighted the kind of Wild West nature of wave energy converters in particular. But I think we saw that there's a pretty large diversity in current energy converters as well. And I think part of that is, there's just different environmental conditions. And then also, as I think it was Pat, maybe you were joking, it's you throw an engineer at a problem and they come up with a different solution. And then, we heard a little bit about Yakutat. Part of the reason that I think different technologies we consider there are that environmental conditions. So the wave energy converter that sits on the bottom may not be a best fit for there. Maybe something that like Cal Wave is looking at might be a better fit. You don't have the sediment issues. And then in that site in particular, maybe the wave resource is a little bit better offshore. So it does seem like we're maybe not going to see kind of the concentration into a generic WEC or a CAC, just because things are so variable.
Yeah.
And then we also heard a little bit, we're making a lot of progress, but everybody commented on also the length of technology development. We saw, Verdant in particular has been at this for a very long time, starting with some very preliminary work in the 1980s at New York University, and now to where they have a technology that's probably technology readiness level 8 or 9. ORPC, I talked with Chris Sauer, their CEO, their former CEO, similar mindset. We're in this for the long run. It takes time to get their technology to where it needs to be. We heard that from the developers, but we also heard that from Alexana. So the project in Egeluk took a long time to get off the ground. And there was a lot of back and forth. I know AEA did some work in Egeluk. I think they sponsored some EPRI studies, if I remember correctly. And those were back in the maybe 2010-ish time period. And, it's now been about 12 years and there's finally something in the water there.
Yeah, there was some funding too through EETF that went to, I believe, ORPC for the Egeluk project. And we actually funded a feasibility study as well for wind in Egeluk that just wrapped up last year. So they're definitely committed to their renewable energy goals for sure.
And is that, Alexana, pretty clear advocate for this. Is that really being driven by the community, Josie?
It does certainly seem that way. Yeah, they are very proactive when it comes to pursuing their renewable energy goals, applying for grants, really vetting out all of the different potential options that are available to them in the community. So yeah, absolutely, they're the gold standard for what it looks like to have an organized effort on that front. She does a great job.
For sure. Yep.
But I think people take it pretty lightly.
It seems to me that Alexana is quite, I would imagine that she would be a very effective speaker in other Alaskan communities.
Absolutely.
To advance these ideas there.
Yeah, and she had a really good point too about the importance of having organization and consistency on the tribal side, which she's been able to provide in Egeluk. Having a community champion like herself, it can just really make or break projects of renewable projects in rural communities.
And she's been super accommodating for all of our requests to to talk to groups like this, which I'm sure it takes a lot of time. Yep. I guess some other things we heard about in passing. I highlighted some changes in the financing. In Alaska, we have the RPS, which could drastically change our how these projects are financed. But there's also the AEA programs that you mentioned, Josie. Could you add a little bit of their background there?
Sure. So the main program that's active currently is the Renewable Energy Fund. I was just thinking about this as I was listening to the webinar, but I do believe that there are certain restrictions both in the application process and the evaluation process related to how developed the technologies are. So I think in some instances there could be limitations on what would be applicable in this space to the Renewable Energy Fund, but I think just depending on how the application is put together, that a lot of these projects are getting to the point where they could potentially be good, strong applicants for the Renewable Energy Fund program. We are currently reviewing applications for round 14. And we do see that program continuing on into the future. Currently the sunset date of the program is in 2023. However, there is a bill currently making its way through the legislature to extend the sunset date by 10 years to 2033. So we're optimistic that that's going to go through and we'll be able to continue to administer the program in coming years. I also did mention the Emerging Energy Technology Fund. That was a partnership or more of an administration program of AEA for DOE, and a number of projects I think that were highlighted in this session were funded at least partially through the Emerging Energy Technology Fund. That program has sunset, I believe, a couple of years ago now. So we aren't obviously accepting applications, but there are a couple legacy projects that are still continuing on. And but yeah, I mean, it would be really great to be able to get another program like that going in the future. But that would just be something that we would need to explore with federal partners and keep an eye on funding opportunities as they become available at the federal level.
So that might be a good thing to keep on our minds with the infrastructure bill. And I believe the ETF program, I think that's the right acronym. We have an ETTF. That's a little bit confusing, but the Emerging Energy Tech Fund, I believe that was maybe co-funded with the Denali Commission at some point.
That sounds
the
right.
Commission has definitely worked in this area as well.
Mm-hmm.
Swinging back to Pat a little bit, Pat, have you participated in the IEC process at all?
Not as much as I should. My colleague Luis Vega, who has now retired, was much more active in the TC 114 activities with the IEC. I try to keep a loose touch on things and have attended one in person and one virtual meeting. But yeah, it's something as a test site that we should be more involved in than we really are. I just need to hire somebody like Colby to come out here and take it over for me.
And the reason I brought that up is, it's the IEC is the International Electrotechnical Committee, I believe. And so when a lot of these projects, especially the early projects started, there were no technical standards at all. And so that the IEC now has power performance characterization standards for both, for wave, river, tidal. They have resource characterization standards as well. There's bodies like EMAC, which are now certified to actually carry out these resource assessments and the power performance assessments. So this is, it's again, it's slow, but the industry is definitely moving towards maturity, and those types of standards help finance the projects. So if you can get an IEC certification, it's much easier to finance a project than if there is no such thing. So Bill Stabby, I know, I think he's the head of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to the IECs, and then some of the panelists, including myself, were active participants in that process. So it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think, at WETS, I mentioned that I feel a little guilty that I'm not more involved in the standards development, but we are doing our best. And like I mentioned it on one of my slides, that, we're trying to follow those standards in terms of, I'm thinking in terms of our power performance assessments as well as the acoustic data collection. So we're following, we're just not really leading in the way that EMAC is in terms of stepping out in front to become a certifying agency.
Well, I'm right there with you. I'm sort of like I might hand this off to someone else. A couple comments in the chat there. So Doug Johnson responded that ORPC is planning to move forward with Cook Inlet. So I take that as an indicator that that cost curve, they're coming down the cost curve. So that's a positive sign. And then also Chris Lee, I think may or may not be on here now, but he's his company Turning an Arm Tidal Energy, I believe that's the name of the company, but they have a preliminary FERC permit for turning an arm in Upper Cook Inlet. And I think both ORPC and Chris are interested in hydrogen production as well. And the other thing we have been going in that area is, I know Bill has mentioned this several times in the chat, the Nutrium, former Nutrium ammonia plant. And so that might be one way to easily tie in tidal into ammonia production. And then another comment in the chat, Chris is here from Tidal Energy Corp. And then Colleen Fisk with REAP posted that there's technical assistance available for communities and projects now through the Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Program. I think I got that acronym right. ETIP. She's got a link there in the chat. I believe REAP and ACEP are both technical providers through that program. Oh, I can't read that quickly. So Elle did post in the chat there. Yeah, and I think Alexandra made this point nicely, and some of our commentators as well. These projects don't happen in Alaska unless there's community leadership, and so that's, it's a big ask, but I think the developers who are on the line probably got that message though. But it's definitely, projects have to be community led, and not just looking at community members as a stakeholder. It's more than that. And so there's certainly opportunity, as Andrea mentioned, for communities to comment during the NEPA process, but really to make these things happen, it's got to come from the community level. I'm sure, Josie, if you want to comment on that for AEA projects, I think that's probably true there too.
It's 100%. That's 100% right, and not just, the project doesn't end at commissioning. There has to be that support of the project after it's commissioned and after it's installed, after construction's complete, and that comes typically from the community level, and that will make or break the success of the project long term. So, yep, that's absolutely right.
And then I'm going to jump in. David sent me a whole list of questions. So I'm going to put this out here. And I think we'll follow, after this is over, there's actually there'll be a survey that we ask you to participate in. And one of the questions of the survey is, should we reconstitute the Hydrokinetic Energy Working Group? I'm not sure, is there an active wind working group currently?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we do. We do have a wind working group. Actually, REAP is the facilitator for the wind working group.
Great. And
I'll add you to the distribution list.
Ooh, don't add me.
Oh, come on.
But there used to be one for hydrokinetic energy, but that did tail off. And so that will be one of the poll questions, whether we should reconstitute the hydrokinetic energy working group. And one of the questions David asked, and I know where this is coming from, and you can put your maybe responses to the chat if you have strong feelings about it, but does hydrokinetic energy in Alaska need a roadmap? This is something that the nuclear work group is, that's where they're headed, and the folks who hosted the Gwen and all the other folks who participated in that nuclear workshop that preceded this one, that's where they're going with that workshop. So I didn't have that in mind when I started this, but I will put that question out there if folks would be interested in developing a roadmap for Hydrokinetic Alaska. And then David also asked, what have Alaskans learned from integrating other intermittent resources into rural diesel powerhouses that could inform hydrokinetic development? One of the things he pointed out in his notes was you need a local project champion. So we just touched on that. It's really kind of driven by the community. And then we did hear this a few other times. It's not always possible to go diesel off. So that should always be kind of a factor. You might end up running your diesel, well, you might not end up saving as much diesel as you thought because you have to idle your diesel basically, especially if you don't have a battery energy storage system or other means of energy storage. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And then David also points out the higher the renewable penetration, the more expensive and complicated the integration tends to be. And then also, if you turn diesels off, you got to have an alternate source of heat because those diesels are typically providing heat for the powerhouse. So that's some things that complicate projects in Alaska. And then power cost equalization. We didn't hear a whole lot about that. But that does tend to make so, and I am not an expert on power cost equalization at all. In fact, I get tripped up every time. But that does tend to, basically a subsidy that seeks to reduce the cost for consumers of electricity in rural Alaska. It does have the side effect of making the economics for renewables maybe not as favorable. So that's also something to consider in your planning process. With that, I'm just going to open it up. If you have any closing thoughts, Josie and Patrick, thank you very much.
I don't think well, just thanks for involving me and the wave energy community a little bit in this discussion. And yeah, it's piqued my interest in application to Alaska's needs specifically. So I think it's been, I'm sorry I missed yesterday, but today was great and very informative.
Yeah, I would echo the praise of the sessions. I thought that they were very well-rounded, a good variety of topics and speakers. So yeah, that was really great. Well done. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone. And with that, we'll wrap it up. So thanks everyone for joining. As I fumble with my script here. So thanks for joining with the Going with the Flow Ocean and River Energy Workshop in Alaska, and sponsored by the Alaska Center for Energy Power. The recording of the workshop will hopefully be available at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at a later date. So please continue to check back. We'll be sending out a short survey following up the workshop, and we would love your feedback. We'll drop that into the chat now. And we hope you enjoyed the workshop and the content was valuable. Please take a minute to complete the short survey to help planning with future workshops. So thank you very much. And then we sincerely appreciate all the moderators, panelists, and the virtual attendees. It's quite rewarding to having everybody participate. And our next free virtual workshop, Hydrogen in the High North, Decarbonizing Fuels, is happening on Tuesday, April 6th and Tuesday, April 5th and Wednesday, April 6th. I think we did see a lot about hydrogen, so hopefully folks who are participating here will join that one. And then there's also the upcoming Arctic X Innovation Lab event, sponsored by the Department of Energy, the Arctic Energy Office, and the Office of Technology Transitions. That will be happening in person on May 23rd. And of course, we hope to see you all at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in Anchorage at the Denina Center, May 24th through 26th. And with that, I will let you go. Thank you all.